Montana Territory, 1883. The wind cut across the open plains like a knife carrying snow and ice in its wake. The small wooden ranch house stood defiant against the growing storm, but inside a different kind of tempest was reaching its end. Thatcher Sullivan knelt beside the bed, his large, weathered hands engulfing the pale, delicate one that rested on the quilt. The room smelled of blood and sweat, of life and death intertwined. In the corner, the midwife worked silently, wrapping a tiny bundle in clean linen. Thatcher. Clara's voice was barely a whisper, each word costing her precious strength. Her golden hair, once vibrant as summer wheat, lay damp against the pillow. Her blue eyes, usually bright with laughter, now struggled to focus on his face. "I'm here, my love," Thatcher said, his voice breaking. He was a tall man, broad-shouldered from years of riding with the Pony Express and later working his ranch. A man accustomed to action, to solving problems with his hands and will, but here now he was powerless. "Name her Hope," Clara said, her fingers tightening momentarily around his. "Promise me, promise she'll never know the world as cold as I've known it." Thatcher swallowed hard, his throat constricting. "I promise. She'll know only warmth and love, just like you've shown me." Clara's lips curved into a faint smile. "Hold her, Thatcher. Let me see you together." The midwife approached with the bundle, placing the newborn daughter in Thatcher's arms. He held her awkwardly, afraid his rough hands might somehow harm this tiny creature. The baby's face was red, and wrinkled eyes squeezed shut against the harshness of the world she'd just entered. "She has your strength," Clara whispered, reaching out to touch the infant's cheek. "And your stubbornness, I'd wager." Thatcher tried to smile, but his face wouldn't cooperate. Something was happening to Clara. Her breathing had become more labored, the spaces between each breath stretching longer. "Clara, don't," he started, but she shook her head slightly. "Love her enough for both of us," she said, her voice fading like mist. "And forgive yourself, Thatcher, for whatever comes." Her hand went limp in his. The room fell silent except for the howling wind outside and the soft mewling sounds of the newborn. The midwife moved forward, checking Clara's pulse, then looked at Thatcher with solemn eyes and shook her head. "I'm sorry, Mr. Sullivan." Thatcher sat frozen, the child in his arms and his wife's hand still in his. Something broke inside him, a dam he'd built years ago during the war, reinforced through hardship and loss. But he didn't cry. Not yet. He stood cradling his daughter and walked to the window. Outside, the storm was building snow, swirling in violent patterns against the darkening sky. "Hope," he whispered to the bundle in his arms. "Your mama named you Hope." The baby opened her eyes, then staring up at him with unfocused newborn eyes that would someday be Clara's blue. Thatcher carried her out onto the covered porch, standing at the edge where snow drifted against the railings. He held her up to the sky like an offering or a question. "I swear to you, Clara," he said to the storm. "I swear to God. She will know love. She will know warmth. I will give my life to keep that promise." The wind seemed to pause just for a moment, as if acknowledging his vow. Then it returned with renewed fury, driving snow against his face, mingling with the tears he finally allowed to fall. Inside, the midwife had covered Clara's face with the sheet. "Mr. Sullivan, I can stay until morning, but then I must return to town. My other patients—" "Go now," Thatcher said, his voice hollow. "The storm's only getting worse. I'll manage." "Sir, the baby needs—" "I said I'll manage." His tone left no room for argument. The midwife nodded, gathered her things, and left after giving brief instructions for the infant's care. Alone with his daughter and his dead wife, Thatcher moved through the house like a ghost. He laid Hope in the cradle Clara had spent months preparing, tucking the blankets around her tiny form. Then he returned to Clara's side, sitting beside her until the fire burned low and the room grew cold. Before dawn, with the storm still raging, Thatcher carried Clara's body outside. The ground was frozen solid, but he took a pickaxe and shovel and began to work. The physical labor was a relief, each strike against the unyielding earth, an outlet for the grief that threatened to consume him. It took hours to dig a proper grave. His hands blistered and bled, but he barely noticed. By the time he lowered Clara's body wrapped in their wedding quilt into the ground, the snow had reached his knees. "Sleep well, my love," he whispered as he began to fill the grave. "I'll keep our promise." When he returned to the house, his clothes stiff with ice and snow, Hope was crying. The sound sliced through him, high and desperate. It blended with the howling wind into a haunting melody of loss and need. Thatcher stood in the doorway, paralyzed. The tiny being in the cradle was completely dependent on him, and he had no idea what to do. Clara had been the one reading books about child rearing, talking to other mothers preparing. Thatcher had been focused on expanding the ranch, securing their future, a future that now seemed impossible. He approached the cradle cautiously as if it contained something dangerous rather than his own daughter. "Hush now," he said awkwardly. "Your pa's here." Hope continued to wail, her face scrunched and red. Thatcher picked her up and holding her against his chest the way the midwife had shown him. She kept crying. "You must be hungry," he realized. The midwife had left some goat's milk and instructions for feeding. With one arm holding Hope, he clumsily attempted to prepare the bottle. The milk spilled, the bottle wouldn't seal properly, and Hope's cries grew more frantic. Sweat beaded on Thatcher's forehead despite the cold. "Please," he whispered. "Please just tell me what you need." But Hope only cried harder, and Thatcher felt the first tendrils of panic taking root. What if he couldn't do this? What if he failed Clara's dying wish on the very first day? "No," he said firmly, more to himself than to the baby. "I can do this. I will do this." It took nearly an hour, but he finally managed to get some milk into Hope. She quieted, blinking up at him with exhausted eyes before falling asleep. Thatcher placed her back in the cradle and collapsed into a chair. Outside, the storm continued unabated. Inside, a different kind of storm was just beginning. For 3 days, Thatcher barely slept. Hope required constant attention, feeding, changing, comforting. He struggled with each task, his large hands seemingly ill-suited for the delicate work of caring for an infant. The goat's milk didn't agree with her. She developed colic and cried for hours. Thatcher paced the floor with her singing off-key renditions of the trail songs he remembered from his Pony Express days. Nothing seemed to help. Hope lost weight, her newborn chubbiness giving way to a concerning thinness. Her cries grew weaker but more plaintive. Thatcher's pride kept him from seeking help. He'd promised Clara he would care for their daughter, and admitting he couldn't manage seemed like the first step in breaking that promise. Besides, who would he ask? The nearest neighbor was 5 miles away, and with the continuing storm, the journey would be dangerous. On the 4th morning, as dawn broke over a landscape transformed into endless white, Thatcher sat in Clara's rocking chair, Hope fussing weakly in his arms. He glanced up at the wedding portrait on the mantel. Clara in her simple white dress, her smile so bright it seemed to illuminate the photograph from within. "I'm failing her, Clara," he whispered. "I'm failing you both." Hope made a small, pitiful sound, and something shifted in Thatcher's heart. Clara wouldn't want his pride to endanger their daughter. She would want Hope to live, to thrive, no matter what it took. "You're right," he said to the portrait. "I can't do this alone." The decision made, Thatcher moved with renewed purpose. He fed Hope one more time, changed her, and wrapped her in every blanket he could find. He bundled himself in his heaviest coat, strapped on his gun belt out of habit, and prepared his most reliable horse, Thunder. The world outside was a study in white. The snow had drifted higher than the porch in places, and the wind still blew, though with less fury than before. Thatcher tucked Hope inside his coat against his chest, leaving just enough space for her to breathe. "Hold on, little one," he murmured. "We're going to find help." The ride to Silver Creek was normally an hour, but through the snow it took nearly 3. Thatcher kept one arm wrapped protectively around the bundle against his chest, feeling the reassuring movement of Hope's breathing. Thunder picked his way carefully through snowdrifts, sometimes sinking to his chest before finding more solid footing. By the time the small town came into view, Thatcher was half frozen and wholly desperate. Silver Creek consisted of one main street with a handful of businesses, a general store, a saloon, a small hotel, and a bank owned by Harlan Blackwood, the richest man in the territory. Most of the buildings were dark, their occupants wisely staying inside during the storm. But a light burned in the window of Daniel's general store. Thatcher directed Thunder toward it, sliding from the saddle with stiff, clumsy movements. He nearly fell as his boots hit the ground, his legs numb from cold and the long ride. The bell above the door jangled as Thatcher entered, bringing a blast of cold air with him. The store was empty except for a woman behind the counter. She wore a simple black dress that hung loose on her slender frame, her dark hair pulled back in a practical bun. When she looked up, her deep brown eyes showed first surprise, then wariness. "We're closed," she said, her voice soft but firm. "Mr. Daniels is ill, and I'm only here to inventory stock." Thatcher pulled back his coat, revealing Hope's face. "Please," he said, his voice hoarse from cold and disuse. "My daughter needs help." The woman's expression changed instantly. She came around the counter, moving with quick grace. How old is she? 4 days, Thatcher replied. Her mother died in childbirth. The woman's eyes softened with understanding. May I? She asked, holding out her arms. Thatcher hesitated only briefly before carefully transferring Hope to her. The woman cradled the infant with practiced ease, examining her with gentle fingers. She's underweight and dehydrated, the woman said. What have you been feeding her? Goat's milk, like the midwife said, but she doesn't seem to keep it down. The woman nodded thoughtfully. It needs to be watered down for one so young and warmed just right. She looked up at Thatcher, taking in his exhausted state. I'm Alma Freeman. Thatcher Sullivan. My ranch is south of here beyond Cooper's Creek. Alma's fingers stilled momentarily on Hope's blanket. Sullivan Ranch. A shadow crossed her face so quickly Thatcher almost missed it. Yes, I've owned it 5 years now. Alma seemed to come to a decision. Your daughter needs proper care, Mr. Sullivan. I can show you how to feed her correctly, but she'll need more than that. Anything, Thatcher said. I'll pay whatever. This isn't about money, Alma interrupted. She hesitated, then continued. I lost my husband Isaiah last summer, and my sons Moses and Elijah to the fever soon after. I know what it is to care for little ones, and I know what it is to lose family. Thatcher nodded slowly, recognizing the depth of loss in her eyes. It mirrored his own. I'm sorry for your suffering, Mrs. Freeman. As I am for yours, she replied. She looked down at Hope, who had quieted in her experienced arms. I'll help you, Mr. Sullivan, but not for your sake. For hers. Relief washed over Thatcher, making his knees weak. Thank you. I don't know how to repay. You can start by sitting down before you fall down, Alma said practically. You look half frozen. I'll make some tea while I prepare a proper bottle for this little one. Thatcher sank gratefully onto a bench near the store's pot-bellied stove. As warmth gradually returned to his limbs, he watched Alma move efficiently around the space, heating water, mixing milk with just the right amount of water, testing the temperature on her wrist. There was something both competent and graceful in her movements, despite the grief that seemed to hang around her like a shadow. What's her name? Alma asked as she returned with the bottle. Hope, Thatcher said. Clara named her before she passed. Alma nodded, a small smile touching her lips. A good name. Strong. She demonstrated the proper way to hold the baby for feeding, then handed her back to Thatcher. Like this. Support her head, keep her slightly elevated. Thatcher mimicked Alma's position, and to his amazement, Hope began to drink eagerly from the bottle. She's taking it, he said, unable to keep the wonder from his voice. Babies know what they need, Alma replied. They just need us to listen. While Hope fed, Alma gathered supplies: clean cloths for diapers, a proper glass bottle with a better nipple, a small tin of talcum powder, and a jar of goat's milk. She wrapped everything carefully in brown paper. This will help for a few days, she said. But she needs consistent care. She hesitated, seeming to debate with herself. I can come to your ranch tomorrow. Show you more of what you'll need to know. Thatcher looked up from Hope's face, surprised by the offer. You'd do that? As I said, not for you, for her. Alma's tone was cool, but her eyes, when they rested on Hope, were warm. No child should suffer if it can be prevented. Thatcher wanted to ask about her apparent reluctance about the shadow that crossed her face when he mentioned his ranch, but Hope had finished her bottle and was beginning to fuss again. Alma showed him how to burp her, another skill he'd been doing wrong. Tomorrow then, he said as he prepared to leave, Hope once again secured inside his coat. I'm in your debt, Mrs. Freeman. Alma, she corrected, and we'll see about debts, Mr. Sullivan. Safe journey home. The ride back to the ranch was less harrowing, the storm having subsided to occasional flurries. Hope slept soundly against Thatcher's chest, the first peaceful sleep she'd had since Clara died. Thatcher found himself praying, something he hadn't done since the war, that Alma Freeman would indeed come tomorrow as promised. For the first time in 4 days, he felt a flicker of hope that he might be able to keep his promise to Clara after all. Dawn broke clear and cold the next morning. Thatcher had slept in short bursts, waking whenever Hope stirred. But the new feeding method Alma had shown him seemed to be working. Hope was less fussy and had kept down most of her milk. He spent the early hours tending to the ranch, feeding the livestock that had weathered the storm in the barn, breaking ice on the water troughs, assessing damage to fences and outbuildings. The work was familiar grounding, though his exhaustion made every task take twice as long. By mid-morning, he'd begun to doubt that Alma would come. The roads were still nearly impassable in places, and he wouldn't blame her for reconsidering the journey. He was in the barn repairing a stall door that had broken during the storm when he heard the jingle of harness bells. Thatcher stepped out into the sunlight, shielding his eyes against the glare off the snow. A small one-horse sleigh was approaching runners, cutting smooth tracks through the fresh powder. Alma Freeman sat tall in the driver's seat, wrapped in a practical wool coat and scarf. Relief flooded through him, followed immediately by an unexpected nervousness. He suddenly became aware of his disheveled appearance, the stubble on his jaw, the fact that the house was in disarray. Alma brought the sleigh to a halt near the barn. Thatcher moved forward to help her down, but she had already disembarked carrying a large basket covered with a cloth. "Mrs. Freeman, Alma," Thatcher corrected himself. "Thank you for coming." She nodded, her eyes taking in the ranch, the neat barn, the corral now half buried in snow, the small but solid house with smoke rising from the chimney. "Where is Hope?" she asked, practical as ever. "Sleeping in her cradle. I've been checking on her between chores." "Let me see her," Alma said, already moving toward the house. The interior of the Sullivan home was simple but had once been cozy. A stone fireplace dominated the main room with a rocking chair and small sofa positioned before it. A kitchen area occupied one corner with a solid table in the center. Two doors led off the main room, one to Thatcher's bedroom, the other to what had been intended as a nursery, but remained unfinished. Now the house bore the marks of recent tragedy and Thatcher's struggles. Dishes were piled in the wash basin, clothes and blankets were strewn about, and the air held the stale odor of grief and neglect. If Alma was bothered by the state of things, she didn't show it. She went straight to the cradle near the fire, bending to examine Hope with gentle hands. "She's breathing easier," Alma noted, "and her color is better. You've done well with the feeding." "Thanks to your instructions," Thatcher said. He hovered awkwardly, unsure of his place in his own home, now that a more competent caretaker had arrived. Alma straightened, removing her coat and rolling up her sleeves. "I've brought more supplies," she said, indicating the basket, "and I'll show you how to properly bathe her today." But first, she looked pointedly at the dishes in general disarray. "I know it's a mess," Thatcher said, embarrassed. "I haven't had time to—" "A clean home is healthier for a baby," Alma interrupted, not unkindly. "I'll tend to Hope if you'd like to start on those dishes." There was something in her tone, not quite a challenge, but close, that made Thatcher straighten his shoulders. "Yes, ma'am," he said with the faintest hint of irony. A flicker of something that might have been amusement crossed Alma's face, but it vanished quickly. She turned her attention to unpacking her basket, which contained not only baby supplies, but also a loaf of fresh bread, some dried herbs, and clean cloths. For the next hour, they worked in parallel, Thatcher cleaning the kitchen and main room, Alma caring for Hope, preparing a proper bath in a small tin tub she'd brought. The silence between them wasn't exactly comfortable, but it was purposeful, each focused on their tasks. When Hope was bathed, powdered, and dressed in a clean gown Alma had brought, she demonstrated the proper swaddling technique. "Snug, but not too tight," she explained. "They feel secure this way, like they're still in the womb." Hope, who had fussed during the bath, settled immediately once swaddled, her eyes growing heavy. Thatcher watched in amazement. "You have a gift," he said. Alma's expression remained neutral. "Practice, not gift. I had 2 boys of my own, remember." "How old were they?" Thatcher asked softly. "Moses was 6. Elijah was 4. Alma's voice held steady, but her hands trembled slightly as she laid Hope in the cradle. "They were good boys, bright, always running, always curious." "I'm truly sorry for your loss," Thatcher said, meaning it. He knew all too well the hollow space grief carved inside a person. Alma nodded once, acknowledging his sympathy without inviting further conversation on the subject. "The bedroom," she said, changing the topic. Has it been cleaned since?" Thatcher shook his head. "I haven't been able to." He trailed off, unable to articulate the paralyzing grief that seized him whenever he thought of entering the room where Clara had died. "I understand," Alma said, and he believed she truly did. "But it needs to be done, for health and for healing." "I'll do it," Thatcher said quickly. The thought of Alma cleaning Clara's blood from the sheets was somehow unbearable. "Very well, I'll prepare some lunch while you work. You need your strength if you are to care for Hope properly." Thatcher hesitated at the bedroom door, his hand on the knob. Taking a deep breath, He entered, closing the door behind him. The room was exactly as it had been 4 days ago, the bed unmade sheets stained with birth blood, Clara's hairbrush still on the small table beside it. Her scent lingered, fading, but present, a mixture of lavender and something uniquely Clara. Grief hit him anew, a physical pain in his chest. For a moment he couldn't move, couldn't breathe. Then mechanically he began to strip the bed, bundling the sheets for washing. He opened the window despite the cold, needing fresh air to clear both the room and his head. Under the bed he noticed Clara's keepsake box, a carved wooden chest where she kept letters, ribbons, and small mementos. He pulled it out, running his fingers over the lid. Inside were the letters he'd written her during their courtship, a dried flower from their wedding, and the plans she'd drawn for the nursery. At the bottom was a small, leather-bound journal. Thatcher knew he shouldn't read it. Clara had always been private about her writing, but he found himself opening it anyway, hungry for any connection to her. The last entry was dated just 2 days before she died. "The baby moves constantly now," she had written. "Thatcher teases that we're having a horse, not a child, with all this kicking. I pray for a girl, though I haven't told him. A daughter with his strength and hopefully less of his stubbornness. I worry sometimes about what kind of mother I'll be. My own was so distant, so cold. I want our child to know only warmth and love. Thatcher will be a wonderful father. He doesn't believe it, but I've seen how gentle he can be, how patient when it matters. If anything happens to me, I know he'll keep our child safe. But I've asked God to let me stay, to let me see our baby grow. There's so much I want to teach her." Tears blurred Thatcher's vision. He closed the journal, pressing it to his chest for a moment before returning it to the box. Clara had believed in him, he had trusted him to care for their child. He couldn't fail her. With renewed resolve, he finished cleaning the room, putting fresh sheets on the bed and organizing Clara's belongings. Her clothes he left hanging in the wardrobe, unable to contemplate removing them yet. When he emerged, the main room had been transformed. The floors were swept, surfaces dusted, and the scent of something savory came from the kitchen area where Alma was stirring a pot of stew. "You didn't have to do all this," Thatcher said, genuinely moved by the effort she'd made. "A hot meal and a clean house are necessities, not luxuries, Mr. Sullivan," Alma replied, but her expression had softened somewhat, especially with a new baby. They ate lunch at the table, Hope sleeping peacefully in her cradle. The stew was simple but flavorful, with herbs Thatcher didn't recognize. "This is delicious," he said after his first spoonful. "I haven't had a proper meal since—" He didn't finish the sentence. "Food nourishes more than the body," Alma said. "My grandmother taught me that. She was a healer back in Tennessee before the war, knew every plant and its purpose." "She taught you well," Thatcher said. He hesitated, then asked, would you consider staying just for a few days until I get my bearings with Hope? I can pay you fair wages." Alma set down her spoon, her expression unreadable. "I have responsibilities in town. Mr. Daniels relies on me to manage the store while he's ill." "Of course," Thatcher said quickly. "I understand. I just thought—" "But," Alma continued, "I could perhaps arrange to stay for a short time, a week no more. Mr. Daniels' niece arrives from Helena next week to help him, and Hope does need consistent care while you establish a routine." Relief washed over Thatcher. "Thank you. Truly." Alma nodded businesslike. "I'll need to return to town to collect my things and make arrangements. I can be back by tomorrow afternoon." "I'll prepare the spare room," Thatcher said. "It's small, but—" "It will be sufficient," Alma assured him. "Now let me show you how to prepare enough bottles for the night so you don't have to mix formula in the dark." After demonstrating more baby care techniques and leaving Thatcher with detailed instructions for the night, Alma prepared to depart. The day was waning and she needed to reach town before dark. As she donned her coat and gloves, Thatcher stood awkwardly by the door. "I don't know how to thank you properly," he said. "Take good care of Hope," Alma replied. "That's all the thanks I require." Thatcher nodded, opening the door for her partner. "Tomorrow, then." "Tomorrow," Alma agreed, stepping out into the crisp air. As she settled into her sleigh, Thatcher noticed her glance toward the small, fenced area beside the house, Clara's final resting place marked by a simple wooden cross. A shadow crossed Alma's face, a flicker of some emotion Thatcher couldn't identify. "Safe journey," he called as she flicked the reins, setting the horse in motion. Alma raised a hand in acknowledgement but didn't look back. Thatcher watched until the sleigh disappeared around the bend, then returned inside to where Hope was beginning to stir. "She's coming back, little one," he told his daughter, lifting her carefully from the cradle. "We're going to be all right." That night, using the techniques Alma had taught him, Thatcher managed Hope's feedings with growing confidence. She slept for longer stretches, and he found himself able to rest as well, if only in short bursts. In the quiet pre-dawn hours, he sat in Clara's rocking chair, Hope sleeping against his chest, and allowed himself to think about Alma Freeman. There was something familiar about her name, about her family's story, that tugged at the edges of his memory. And there had been that strange moment of recognition, almost distress, when he'd mentioned Sullivan Ranch. Before he could pursue the thought further, Hope stirred, demanding her next feeding. Thatcher pushed his musings aside, focusing on the immediate needs of his daughter. The next day dawned clear and cold. Thatcher completed his chores early, then spent time preparing the small spare room for Alma's arrival. It was a simple space originally intended as a sewing room for Clara, with a narrow bed and a small dresser. He cleaned it thoroughly, laid fresh linens on the bed, and even placed a small vase of dried lavender on the windowsill, the last of Clara's supply from the previous summer. By early afternoon, he found himself watching the road with growing anticipation. Hope had been fed and was sleeping peacefully, and Thatcher had even managed to shave and change into a clean shirt. The house was in better order than it had been in weeks. When Alma's sleigh finally appeared, Thatcher felt an unexpected surge of relief. He'd half convinced himself she wouldn't return, that her promise had been mere politeness. This time her sleigh carried not just a basket, but a small trunk and several parcels. Thatcher hurried out to help her, taking the trunk while she gathered the smaller items. "Welcome back," he said, genuinely pleased to see her. Alma nodded, her expression composed as always. "How is Hope today?" "Better, sleeping more, crying less. Your instructions were a godsend." A hint of a smile touched Alma's lips. "Good. Babies thrive on routine and proper care." She glanced around, noting the cleared pathways and general improvement in the ranch's appearance. "You've been busy." "Seemed the least I could do," Thatcher replied, leading the way inside. Hope was just waking as they entered, making small, mewling sounds from her cradle. Alma went to her, immediately lifting her with practiced ease. "Hello, little one," she murmured, her voice softening in a way Thatcher hadn't heard before. "You're looking stronger already." Thatcher showed Alma to the spare room, setting her trunk beside the bed. "I hope this will be comfortable," he said. "It's not much, but—" "It's fine, Mr. Sullivan," Alma interrupted. "I don't require luxury." "Thatcher," he corrected. "If you're to live here even temporarily—" "Mr. Sullivan seems overly formal." Alma considered this, then nodded. "Very well. Thatcher." She looked around the room, her gaze lingering on the lavender. "Was this your wife's room?" "No, Clara and I shared the main bedroom. This was to be her sewing room eventually." He hesitated. The lavender was hers. She grew it in a small garden behind the house. Something in Alma's expression softened further. "It's a thoughtful touch. Thank you." An awkward silence fell between them, broken only by Hope's soft sounds as she nestled against Alma's shoulder. "I should let you settle in," Thatcher said finally. "I need to check the north pasture fence. It was damaged in the storm." "Will you be all right with Hope?" "Of course," Alma said, her competence returning like a shield. "We'll be fine. Take whatever time you need." Thatcher nodded, grateful for the opportunity to escape the confines of the house and the strange tension that seemed to exist between them. Outside in the cold, clear air, he could think more clearly. Alma Freeman was a puzzle. Her grief was evident, but she contained it with remarkable discipline. She was kind to Hope, efficient in her work, but maintained a careful distance from Thatcher himself. And there was still that nagging sense that he should know something about her family. The north pasture fence took longer to repair than he'd anticipated. Several posts had been completely uprooted by the combination of wind and snow, requiring Thatcher to dig new holes in the partially frozen ground. By the time he finished, the sun was low on the horizon, casting long shadows across the snow. As he approached the house, he noticed smoke rising steadily from the chimney and light glowing in the windows. For a moment, the scene was so domestic, so reminiscent of coming home to Clara, that he stopped in his tracks, a pain sharp as a knife twisting in his chest. Then the door opened and Alma stood framed in the light, Hope cradled in one arm. "Supper's nearly ready," she called. "You must be frozen through." The image shifted, became its own reality rather than a ghost of the past. Thatcher continued forward, stamping snow from his boots before entering. The house was warm, filled with the aroma of cooking food. Hope was awake but content watching the world with the unfocused gaze of the newborn. Alma had transformed the kitchen area, organizing Clara's scattered utensils and implements into a more efficient arrangement. "You didn't have to cook," Thatcher said, removing his coat and gloves. "We all need to eat," Alma replied simply, "and cooking keeps the hands busy while the mind rests." Thatcher understood this wisdom. Physical labor had always been his refuge from difficult thoughts. They ate at the table, Hope resting in her cradle nearby. Alma had prepared a simple but hearty meal of salt pork beans and cornbread. The silence between them was more comfortable than before the shared activity of eating, requiring no conversation. After the meal, as Thatcher washed the dishes he'd insisted given that Alma had cooked, she settled in the rocking chair with Hope humming softly. The tune was unfamiliar to Thatcher, haunting and beautiful. "What song is that?" he asked. Alma glanced up, seeming almost startled that he'd notice. "An old spiritual my grandmother taught me. Wade in the water." "It's lovely," Thatcher said. "Hope seems to like it." Indeed, the baby was gazing up at Alma with what appeared to be contentment, her previous fussiness gone. "Music speaks to the soul," Alma said, "even the youngest soul." She continued humming, her fingers gently stroking Hope's cheek. Thatcher finished the dishes and settled on the sofa, suddenly aware of how tired he was. The past few days had been an emotional and physical marathon. "You should rest," Alma said, noticing his exhaustion. "I'll tend to Hope tonight. You've had too many sleepless nights already." Thatcher wanted to protest, it was his responsibility after all, but the thought of uninterrupted sleep was too tempting. "Wake me if you need anything," he said instead. "Anything at all." Alma nodded, continuing to rock and hum. Thatcher retreated to his bedroom, leaving the door ajar so he could hear if needed. For the first time since Clara's death, he changed into proper night clothes rather than simply collapsing in his daywear. The sheets were clean and cool, and the pillow soft beneath his head. He expected sleep to claim him immediately, but instead found himself lying awake listening to the faint sounds of Alma moving about the house tending to Hope. There was something both comforting and disconcerting about having another presence in the home he'd shared with Clara. Eventually, the combination of physical exhaustion and emotional drain pulled him under into a deep, dreamless sleep. He woke to sunlight streaming through the window and the unfamiliar sensation of being well rested. For a moment, he was disoriented. Then memory rushed back: Clara's death, Hope's birth, Alma's arrival. Thatcher rose quickly, pulling on his clothes and moving into the main room. Alma was already up, feeding Hope while a pot of coffee bubbled on the stove. "Good morning," she said, glancing up. "You needed the rest. You slept straight through Hope's midnight feeding." "You should have woken me," Thatcher said, though he was grateful for the uninterrupted sleep. There was no need. She fed well and went right back to sleep. Alma finished with the bottle and lifted Hope to her shoulder, patting her back gently. "There's coffee, if you'd like." Thatcher poured himself a cup, inhaling the rich aroma. "Thank you for all of this." Alma merely nodded, her focus on Hope. When the baby had been burped and settled, Alma handed her to Thatcher. "Hold her while I prepare breakfast. She needs time with her father." Thatcher took Hope carefully, still not entirely confident in his ability to hold something so small and precious. But she settled against him readily enough, her tiny hand curling around his finger with surprising strength. "She has a good grip," he observed, a note of pride in his voice. "Yes," Alma agreed. "She's stronger than she looks." As Alma moved about the kitchen, Thatcher noticed for the first time that she had removed her gloves. Her hands, exposed as she worked, bore the unmistakable scarring of burns, old injuries that had healed but left their mark. The scars covered her palms and extended partway up her wrists, disappearing beneath her sleeves. Thatcher tried not to stare, but Alma caught his gaze and stilled. Self-consciously, she moved to retrieve her gloves from the counter. "You don't have to hide them," Thatcher said quietly. "Not on my account." Alma hesitated, then left the gloves where they were. "Most people find them disturbing." "They're badges of survival," Thatcher replied. "Nothing to be ashamed of." A complicated expression crossed Alma's face, surprise perhaps, or a reassessment. "They're from the fire," she said after a moment. "The one that took Isaiah. I tried to pull him out, but..." She trailed off, the memory clearly still painful. "I'm sorry," Thatcher said, meaning it. He knew better than to press for details when the wound was obviously still raw. Alma turned back to her cooking, but the silence between them had shifted yet again, becoming something less guarded. After breakfast, Alma suggested they move Hope's cradle into the unfinished nursery. She needs her own space, she explained. And you need to start thinking of this as her home, not just yours. Together, they cleared the room of building materials and half-completed projects. Thatcher brought in the cradle while Alma arranged the bedding in a small chest for Hope's growing collection of clothes and supplies. Clara had plans for this room, Thatcher said as they worked. She wanted to paint it yellow, said it was a happy color, good for a child. She was right, Alma said. Yellow is the color of hope and new beginnings. Thatcher looked at her, struck by the observation. You're a woman of surprising depth, Alma Freeman. A ghost of a smile touched her lips. Most people are deeper than they appear, Mr. Sullivan. We just rarely take the time to notice. As the day progressed, they fell into a natural rhythm. Alma caring for Hope in the house, Thatcher tending to the ranch and assisting with Hope when needed. By evening, the arrangement felt almost normal, as if they'd been working together for weeks rather than days. After supper, as Thatcher sat by the fire with Hope sleeping in his arms, he found himself wanting to know more about the quiet, competent woman who had so unexpectedly entered their lives. Tell me about your boys, he said softly, if you don't mind speaking of them. Alma was mending one of Hope's gowns, her needle moving in small, precise stitches. She paused, considering the request. Moses was the thoughtful one, she said finally, always watching, thinking before he acted. He loved books, would sit for hours if I read to him. A genuine smile warmed her face at the memory. Elijah was his opposite, always running, climbing, getting into mischief. But he had the biggest heart, found injured animals and brought them home to heal. They sound like fine boys, Thatcher said. They were. Alma's voice held pride alongside the sorrow. Isaiah taught them to be strong but gentle, to stand tall but help others rise. Her needle resumed its rhythm. We were happy, the four of us. It wasn't an easy life, but it was good. And before Silver Creek, Thatcher asked, you mentioned Tennessee. I was born there, yes. My grandmother raised me after my mother died. She was a healer, knew every plant and its purpose, taught me her knowledge. Alma's eyes took on a distant look. During the war, she treated anyone who came to our door, Union, Confederate, it didn't matter to her. Said suffering doesn't wear a uniform. A wise woman, Thatcher observed. The wisest I've known, Alma agreed. After the war, I became a teacher for a time. That's where I met Isaiah. He was building the schoolhouse. Her expression softened at the memory. We came west for a fresh start, like so many others. Found Silver Creek 5 years ago and made it home. Thatcher nodded, understanding the pull of new beginnings. Clara and I came from Colorado. I was riding for the Pony Express, and she was the daughter of a station manager. When the Express folded, we decided to try ranching. He looked around the modest home. It's been hard work, but worthwhile, or it was until you lost her, Alma finished gently. Yes, Thatcher swallowed against the tightness in his throat. Now I'm not sure what the future holds, except that I need to raise hope as best I can. One day at a time, Alma said. That's all any of us can do. They lapsed into silence, but it was comfortable now, each lost in their own thoughts, but somehow less alone than before. Later, as Thatcher prepared for bed, he paused by the nursery where Alma was settling Hope for the night. She was singing softly, that same haunting spiritual, her scarred hands gentle, as they tucked the blanket around the sleeping infant. In that moment, watching this woman who had lost so much, still capable of such tenderness, Thatcher felt something shift inside him, a loosening of the grief that had gripped him since Clara's death. Not its disappearance, but perhaps the first step toward learning to live with it, as Alma was learning to live with her own losses. Good night, he said softly from the doorway. Alma looked up, meeting his gaze. Good night, Thatcher, she replied, using his given name without hesitation for the first time. It was a small thing, but somehow it felt like the beginning of something new. The following morning, as Thatcher returned from the barn, after tending to the livestock, he saw a figure moving inside the house. Through the window, he could make out Alma in the bedroom as she was kneeling beside the bed as if searching for something beneath it. Curious, he entered quietly, not wanting to disturb Hope if she was sleeping. From the main room, he could see Alma more clearly now. She wasn't searching under the bed, she was cleaning and had found something. She sat back on her heels, holding a wooden box in her hands. It took Thatcher a moment to recognize it. An old military chest carved with his rank and initials, Lieutenant T.T. Sullivan. A relic from his brief service during the war, containing memories he'd long tried to forget. Alma opened the box, her expression changing from curiosity to shock as she examined its contents. Inside were Thatcher's military effects, a Union cavalry insignia, a tarnished medal, and a letter on yellowed paper. Thatcher stepped into the doorway. "Find something interesting?" he asked, his voice harder than he'd intended. Alma startled, nearly dropping the box. I, I'm sorry," she said quickly, closing the lid. "I was cleaning and it was just, I shouldn't have pried." Thatcher moved forward, taking the box from her hands. "No, you shouldn't have." Alma rose to her feet, her composure returning despite the flush of embarrassment on her cheeks. "The letter?" she said after a moment. "It was signed by Colonel William Hayes." Thatcher stilled. "You know that name?" "He was my uncle," Alma said quietly. "My mother's brother." The connection clicked into place in Thatcher's mind. Hayes, Freeman, Isaiah Freeman. "Your husband," he said slowly. "He served, didn't he, under Colonel Hayes?" Alma nodded, her eyes never leaving his face. "In the 54th Massachusetts, one of the first colored regiments." Thatcher set the box on the bed, suddenly needing to sit down. "I didn't make the connection until now. Freeman isn't an uncommon name." "No," Alma agreed. "But when I saw the colonel's letter," she hesitated. "He wrote about you in his letters to my mother. Said you were one of the few white officers who treated the colored soldiers as men, not just bodies to be spent." Thatcher felt a weight settling on his shoulders, the past he'd tried to leave behind. "I did what any decent man would do." "No," Alma said firmly. "You didn't. Most didn't. Isaiah told me what it was like serving under officers who saw them as expendable, who wouldn't look them in the eye or learn their names." Thatcher didn't know how to respond. The war had been a dark chapter in his life, one he rarely revisited. His service had been brief but intense, marked by both valor and tragedy. "The uncle you mentioned yesterday," he said, changing the subject slightly. "When you talked about your grandmother treating soldiers from both sides, that was Colonel Hayes." Alma nodded. "He was raised in the North but never forgot his Southern roots. When the war came, he chose the Union, but never lost his compassion for those on the other side." A small, sad smile touched her lips. "He was a good man, died 2 years after the war of wounds that never fully healed." Thatcher remembered the colonel well. A tall, dignified man with a commanding presence but kind eyes. He had been one of the few officers who had genuinely cared for the welfare of all his men, regardless of color. "I served under him for only 8 months," Thatcher said. "But they were formative months. He taught me a great deal about leadership, about seeing the humanity in everyone." He gestured to the box. "That letter was his commendation when I was discharged after being wounded at Petersburg." Alma's eyes widened slightly. "You fought at Petersburg?" "Yes, the crater." Thatcher couldn't keep the grimness from his voice. The Battle of the Crater had been one of the most devastating Union defeats of the war, made worse by the high casualties among the United States colored troops who had been sent in after the initial plan failed. "Isaiah was there," Alma said softly. "He never spoke much about it, but I know it haunted him." The coincidence was too great to be mere chance. Thatcher felt as if the past was reaching forward, entangling itself with the present in ways he couldn't yet understand. "I should finish my chores," he said abruptly, needing space to process this new connection. "Hope will be waking soon for her feeding." Alma nodded clearly, sensing his need for distance. "I've prepared bottles. They're cooling on the counter." Thatcher retrieved the box and left without another word, his mind churning with memories and questions. Outside in the clear winter air, he tried to make sense of the strange twist of fate that had brought Alma Freeman into his life, a woman connected to his past in ways neither of them had realized. The discovery of his military past seemed to create a new barrier between them. For the rest of the day, Thatcher found reasons to stay outside working on ranch tasks that could have waited. Alma remained primarily indoors with Hope, their interactions limited to brief exchanges about the baby's needs. By evening, the tension was palpable. They ate supper in relative silence, the only sounds Hope's occasional coos from her cradle and the clink of utensils against plates. Finally, as Alma rose to clear the dishes, Thatcher spoke. "I'm sorry if I was short with you earlier. The war, it's not something I discuss often." Alma paused, dishes in hand. "We all have parts of our past we'd rather not revisit," she said evenly. "You don't owe me any explanations." "Perhaps not," Thatcher agreed, "but I think we both deserve some honesty given the circumstances." He took a deep breath. "When you first agreed to help with Hope, you said it wasn't for my sake but for hers." There was something in your voice and your manner. You knew something about me, didn't you? Alma set the dishes down slowly, her expression carefully controlled. I knew the name Sullivan Ranch, she admitted. I knew it was where Isaiah died. The confirmation hit Thatcher like a physical blow. The fire last summer, the storage barn. Yes, Alma's voice was steady, but her hands, those scarred hands, trembled slightly. Isaiah was hired to repair the roof. There was a lightning storm. The barn caught fire while he was still inside. Thatcher closed his eyes briefly, the pieces falling into place. I was in town that day delivering cattle to the railroad. My foreman sent word about the fire, but by the time I returned, he looked at Alma, the weight of guilt heavy in his chest. I never knew the worker's name, just that a man had died. My foreman handled the arrangements, the compensation to the family. Isaiah, Alma said softly. His name was Isaiah Freeman. And yes, your foreman brought money. It paid for 3 graves. The implications of her words struck Thatcher with devastating force. 3 graves, your sons. The fever came 2 weeks after Isaiah died. Alma explained, her voice distant now, as if she were reciting facts about strangers rather than her own devastating loss. Without Isaiah's income, we couldn't afford to move from our cabin by the creek. When the water rose after the spring melt, it carried sickness. The boys were gone within days of each other. Thatcher felt sick. The chain of events, Isaiah's death in the fire, the subsequent poverty that kept Alma and her sons in a vulnerable location, the fever that took the boys, all traced back to his ranch, to his responsibility. He struggled to find words adequate to the situation. I had no idea. If I'd known, I would have done more, made sure you and your boys were provided for properly. Would you? Alma asked, a flicker of the old pain visible in her eyes. Or would I have been just another colored widow, unfortunate, but ultimately not your concern? The question stung, but Thatcher forced himself to consider it honestly. What would he have done really if he'd known the full story before Clara's death, before Hope's birth, before he'd experienced the devastating loss of family firsthand? I'd like to think I would have done right by you, he said finally, but I can't say for certain. I was different then, less aware of how quickly everything you love can be taken from you. Alma regarded him silently for a long moment, her expression unreadable. Then she nodded once, as if accepting his honest uncertainty as preferable to false assurances. Why did you agree to help me? Thatcher asked the question that had been nagging at him since she first appeared at his door. Knowing what you knew, feeling what you must have felt toward me in this place. Alma's gaze shifted to Hope, sleeping peacefully in her cradle. Because she's innocent, she said simply, and because I know what it is to be alone with grief as your only companion. She paused, then added, and perhaps because Isaiah would have wanted me to help despite everything. He believed in forgiveness, in doing good even when it's difficult. Thatcher was humbled by her grace, by the strength it must have taken to enter the very property where her husband had died, to help the man whose negligence might have contributed to that death. I don't deserve your help, he said quietly, but I'm grateful for it more than I can express. It's not about deserving, Alma replied. Few of us get what we truly deserve in this life, for better or worse. She began gathering the dishes again. Now, if you'll excuse me, these need washing before they stain. The conversation was clearly over, but something fundamental had changed between them. The unspoken tension had been replaced by a difficult truth acknowledged, if not fully resolved. That night, as Thatcher lay in bed listening to the winter wind outside, he found himself thinking not just of Clara and Hope, but of Isaiah Freeman and his sons, of Colonel Hayes and the lessons of the war, of Alma's scarred hands, evidence of her desperate attempt to save her husband from the flames. The past and present were intertwined in ways he was only beginning to understand. And somewhere in that tangle of grief and guilt, an unexpected connection, lay the possibility of redemption, not just for himself, but perhaps for Alma as well. With that thought, he finally drifted into sleep, more at peace than he had been since Clara's death, despite the new burden of knowledge he now carried. Dawn arrived with a hesitant sun, its pale light filtering through frost-covered windows. Alma stood in the kitchen warming milk for Hope's morning bottle, her mind still churning with the revelations of the previous day. The fact that Thatcher Sullivan had served under her uncle during the war was unexpected enough, but the way he'd reacted to her knowledge about Isaiah's death had surprised her even more. She'd expected defensiveness, perhaps even anger. Instead, she'd seen genuine remorse and a willingness to acknowledge his possible culpability. The sound of Hope's hungry cries drew her from her thoughts. Alma tested the milk's temperature on her wrist, emotions so ingrained from her years of motherhood that it required no conscious thought. As she headed toward the nursery, she passed Thatcher's bedroom door, which stood slightly ajar. Through the gap, she could see him sitting on the edge of the bed, head bowed, shoulders slumped with the weight of exhaustion or sorrow, perhaps both. For a moment, Alma hesitated. Their conversation the previous night had cleared the air somewhat, but had also introduced a new complexity to their arrangement. She was no longer simply a caretaker for his child. She was a living reminder of a tragedy connected to his ranch, to his responsibilities. "Hope's awake," she said softly, deciding against any deeper engagement this early in the morning. Thatcher looked up, his eyes shadowed but alert. "I'll be right there." Alma nodded and continued to the nursery where Hope was working herself into a proper cry, tiny fists waving in frustration. "Hush now, little one," Alma murmured, lifting the baby with practiced ease. "Breakfast is coming." As she settled into the rocking chair Clara had once used bottle in hand, Alma found herself studying Hope's features. At a week old, the baby was still mostly undefined, her face bearing the generic newness of all infants. But there were hints of what was to come. The shape of her eyes reminded Alma of Clara from the one photograph she'd seen in the house, while the determined set of her tiny jaw was all Thatcher. "You'll be a force to reckon with someday," Alma told the baby softly. "Strong like both your parents." From the doorway came Thatcher's voice. "God help us all when that day comes." Alma looked up to find him watching them, his expression a complicated mixture of pride, grief, and something else she couldn't quite identify. He dressed for the day's work, his clothes sturdy and practical against the winter cold. "She's eating well," Alma reported, keeping her tone professional, "and she slept for nearly 4 hours straight last night." "That's progress," Thatcher said. He hesitated, then added, "About yesterday." "It's a new day, Mr. Sullivan," Alma interrupted, not ready to revisit their painful discussion. "With plenty of work to be done." Something flickered across his face, disappointment perhaps, or resignation, but he nodded. "I need to ride out to check the herd. The weather's holding, but another storm's brewing. I can feel it in my bones." "We'll be fine here," Alma assured him. "I thought I might do some baking if that's all right. Your flour supplies are getting low, but there's enough for a loaf or two." "Whatever you think best," Thatcher said. He moved closer, bending to brush a finger against Hope's cheek. The baby continued suckling, oblivious to the tension between the adults who had become her caretakers. "I shouldn't be gone more than a few hours." Alma nodded, her attention seemingly fixed on Hope, though she was acutely aware of Thatcher's proximity, of the faint scent of soap and leather that clung to him. "Be safe," she said as he turned to leave, the words escaping before she could consider them. Thatcher paused in the doorway, looking back with surprise. "I will," he promised, and then he was gone, his footsteps fading as he moved through the house and out into the winter morning. Alma released a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. The situation was becoming more complicated than she had anticipated. When she'd agreed to help with Hope, she'd expected to feel nothing but cool detachment toward Thatcher Sullivan. Instead, she found herself noticing things about him. His gentleness with Hope, his willingness to acknowledge his failings, the way sorrow had etched lines around his eyes that matched her own. "This isn't what I came here for," she told Hope quietly. "I came to help you, not to." She trailed off, unsure how to finish the thought. The baby had finished her bottle, and Alma lifted her to her shoulder, patting her back in a gentle rhythm. "Your papa is a complicated man, little one, and I'm not sure what to make of him yet." After settling Hope back in her cradle for a morning nap, Alma set about her promised baking. The simple physical task of mixing flour, salt, and yeast was soothing, requiring just enough attention to keep her mind from wandering too far into dangerous territory. By mid-morning, the house was filled with the comforting aroma of fresh bread, a scent that reminded Alma of happier days of her own kitchen, where Moses and Elijah had eagerly awaited treats hot from the oven. The memory brought the expected pang of grief, but it was tempered, now softened by time and the immediate demands of caring for Hope. Perhaps this was part of healing, not forgetting never that, but finding a way to carry the past without being crushed by it. A knock at the door startled Alma from her reverie. Visitors were rare enough in town. Out here, miles from Silver Creek, they were nearly unheard of, especially in winter. Wiping her hands on her apron, she moved cautiously to the window, peering out to see who had ventured to Sullivan Ranch on such a cold day. A sleigh stood in the yard, a sturdy bay horse stamping impatiently in the harness. But it was the sleigh's occupant who made Alma's breath catch. Harlan Blackwood, owner of Silver Creek Bank, and one of the most powerful men in the territory. Tall and imposing, even in his 60s, with silver hair and cold eyes, Blackwood was known for his shrewd business dealings and unmerciful approach to debtors. Alma hesitated, unsure whether to answer. She had no authority here, was not the lady of the house, but merely a temporary caretaker. Yet she couldn't simply ignore the man. That would be both rude and potentially problematic for Thatcher. Drawing a deep breath, she opened the door. "Mr. Blackwood," she said, keeping her tone neutral. "Mr. Sullivan isn't here at present. He's out checking the herd." Blackwood's eyebrows rose in apparent surprise at finding Alma at the Sullivan Ranch. "Mrs. Freeman," he said, removing his hat with a courtesy that didn't reach his eyes. "I wasn't aware you had taken up employment here." "A temporary arrangement," Alma explained, uncomfortable under his scrutiny, "to help with Mr. Sullivan's newborn daughter." "Ah, yes, I heard about Mrs. Sullivan's unfortunate passing." Blackwood's expression conveyed appropriate solemnity, but there was something calculating in his gaze as it swept past Alma to the interior of the house. "When do you expect Sullivan to return?" "I couldn't say precisely. A few hours, perhaps." Blackwood seemed to consider this, then nodded. "I'll wait if you don't mind. Bank business, you understand. Quite urgent." Before Alma could respond, he was mounting the porch steps, clearly expecting to be invited inside. Reluctantly, she stepped back, allowing him entry. "I can offer coffee, if you'd like. The fire's warm." "Much appreciated, Mrs. Freeman." Blackwood removed his coat, revealing an expensive suit that seemed out of place in the rustic setting of the ranch. He settled into a chair near the fireplace, his posture impeccable, his gaze taking in every detail of the room. "Something smells delightful." "Fresh bread," Alma said, moving to the kitchen to prepare coffee. "It will be ready soon." As she worked, she could feel Blackwood watching her, his presence filling the small house with an indefinable tension. There had always been something about the banker that made Alma uneasy, though he'd never been anything but properly civil to her. Perhaps it was the way he looked at people, as if calculating their worth in dollars and cents, rather than seeing their humanity. "I must say I'm surprised to find you here," Blackwood commented as she served the coffee. "Given the circumstances." Alma's hand stilled briefly on the cup. "Circumstances, Mr. Blackwood. The unfortunate incident last summer. Your husband's accident on this very property." His tone was conversational, but his eyes were sharp, watching for her reaction. "Most would find it difficult to return to such a place." "Most would," Alma agreed evenly. "But hope needed care, and I was in a position to provide it." Blackwood sipped his coffee, regarding her over the rim of the cup. "Admirable. Your Christian charity does you credit." Something in his tone suggested he didn't quite believe her motivation was so simple. Alma was saved from further conversation by Hope's cry from the nursery. "Excuse me," she said, grateful for the interruption. "The baby needs attention." In the nursery, Alma lifted Hope from her cradle, checking her diaper and finding it dry. The baby seemed more fussy than truly distressed, perhaps sensing the tension in the house. "It's all right," Alma murmured, rocking Hope gently. "Just an unwelcome visitor. He'll be gone soon enough." She took her time tending to Hope, changing her into a fresh gown and swaddling her snugly before returning to the main room. Blackwood had moved from his chair to the window, where he stood looking out at the snow-covered landscape with an air of ownership that Alma found unsettling. "She's a beautiful child," Blackwood observed as Alma re-entered with Hope. "Sullivan must be grateful for your assistance." "It's a mutually beneficial arrangement," Alma said, keeping her distance. "I needed work after Mr. Daniel's niece arrived to help at the store." "Of course." Blackwood stepped closer, peering at Hope with what appeared to be genuine interest. "May I?" Reluctantly, Alma allowed him to look at the baby, though she kept Hope firmly in her own arms. Something protective rose in her, an instinct she thought had died with her son's. "She has her mother's coloring," Blackwood noted, "though perhaps her father's temperament, if that frown is any indication." Indeed, Hope was regarding the stranger with an expression that on an older child might have been called suspicious. Alma couldn't help but feel a flicker of amusement at the baby's apparent good judgment. "Babies often react to unfamiliar faces," she said diplomatically. Blackwood chuckled a sound without real warmth. Indeed they do. He returned to his seat, picking up his coffee cup. Sullivan's in a difficult position, I'd imagine. A new child, no wife, a ranch to run, and of course the note coming due. Alma kept her expression neutral, though the comment caught her attention. A banknote would explain Blackwood's presence, and possibly Thatcher's frequent worried glances toward the horizon, his preoccupation with the ranch's productivity. I wouldn't know about Mr. Sullivan's financial affairs, she said. No, I suppose you wouldn't. Blackwood set down his cup. But as someone temporarily residing here, you might wish to know that this property may soon change hands. Alma's arms tightened around Hope. I don't understand. It's quite simple, Mrs. Freeman. Sullivan took a loan against the ranch last spring for improvements in livestock. The note comes due at the first thaw. Blackwood's smile was thin. Given recent events, the loss of his wife, the expenses of a new child, I think we can reasonably predict he won't be able to meet his obligations. And you're here to, what? Warn him off for an extension. Blackwood's laugh was short and devoid of humor. Banking is a business, Mrs. Freeman, not a charity. I'm here to remind Sullivan of his responsibilities and to begin discussions about the transfer of property should it come to that. The coldness of his approach shocked even Alma, who had no particular reason to wish Thatcher Sullivan well. The man just lost his wife, Mr. Blackwood. His daughter is barely a week old. Tragedy doesn't erase debt, I'm afraid. Blackwood stood, moving to examine the mantelpiece with its few modest decorations, a carved wooden horse, a small clock, the wedding photograph of Thatcher and Clara. Sullivan knew the terms when he signed the papers. Business is business. Before Alma could respond, the sound of approaching hoofbeats announced Thatcher's return. Blackwood turned from the mantelpiece, straightening his already impeccable waistcoat. Ah, just in time. Moments later, the door opened and Thatcher entered, bringing with him a gust of cold air and the scent of horses and open sky. He stopped short at the sight of Blackwood, his expression shifting from surprise to wariness. Blackwood, he said, removing his hat, this is unexpected. Sullivan, the banker inclined his head in greeting. I was just having a pleasant chat with Mrs. Freeman while awaiting your return. Thatcher's gaze moved to Alma, a question in his eyes. She gave a slight shake of her head, indicating nothing untoward had occurred, though the tension in the room was palpable. I hope I didn't miss anything important. Thatcher said, his tone carefully neutral, as he hung his coat by the door. Not at all, Blackwood replied smoothly. I was just admiring your lovely home and remarking on your good fortune in finding such capable help for your daughter. Thatcher moved to stand beside Alma, his proximity feeling oddly protective. I've been blessed in that regard, yes. He looked down at Hope, who had fallen asleep in Alma's arms. Would you mind putting her down? I suspect Mr. Blackwood and I have business to discuss. Alma nodded, grateful for the excuse to leave the increasingly tense atmosphere. As she retreated to the nursery, she heard Blackwood's voice, low and insistent. I'm here about the note, Sullivan, as a courtesy before formal proceedings begin. Alma closed the nursery door, shutting out the rest of the conversation. She laid Hope in her cradle, tucking the blankets around her with hands that trembled slightly from suppressed anger. Blackwood's callousness, his apparent eagerness to capitalize on Thatcher's misfortune, stirred something in her that she thought had been buried along with her family, a sense of justice, of right and wrong that transcended personal grudges. She busied herself tidying the nursery, folding tiny garments and straightening bedding, all the while straining to hear the conversation in the main room. The voices remained low, but their tones told a story of confrontation, of a power imbalance too great to overcome with mere words. When the front door finally closed with a decisive thud, Alma waited a moment before emerging from the nursery. She found the Thatcher standing by the window, watching Blackwood's sleigh disappear down the snow-covered lane. His posture was rigid, his hands clenched at his sides. Mr. Sullivan, she ventured, is everything all right? Thatcher turned, his expression a mask of controlled fury and despair. No, Mrs. Freeman, everything is most certainly not all right. He ran a hand through his hair, a gesture of frustration that seemed to release some of the tension in his frame. But that's hardly your concern. Perhaps not, Alma agreed, moving to check the bread in the oven. But as I'm residing here even temporarily, I believe I have some interest in knowing whether the roof over my head is likely to remain there. Thatcher gave a short, humorless laugh. Fair point. He sank into a chair at the table, suddenly looking older, more worn. Blackwood holds the note on this place. Took it out last spring for improvements, new stock. Had a plan to expand, make this a proper operation that could support a family. And now, Alma prompted when he fell silent. Now the note comes due at the first thaw, and I'm about $500 short of meeting it. Thatcher's voice was flat. Clara's medical bills, the midwife, the funeral. It ate through our savings faster than I anticipated. Alma removed the bread from the oven, setting the golden loaves on the counter to cool. The domestic action seemed incongruous with the gravity of their conversation, yet there was something grounding about continuing with normal tasks in the face of looming disaster. "What will you do?" she asked. Thatcher shook his head. "I don't know. Sell some stock, maybe though prices are low this time of year. Take on extra work if I can find it." He looked up at her, his eyes haunted. "I promised Clara this would be Hope's home, that I'd give her stability, security." "Promises are difficult to keep in this world," Alma said more gently than she'd intended, "no matter how sincere our intentions." "That they are." Thatcher seemed to gather himself, sitting straight at her. "But I'm not giving up without a fight. Blackwood can posture all he wants, but I've got until spring to figure something out." Alma nodded, respecting his determination, even as she doubted its practical application. She'd seen too many good intentions crushed under the wheel of financial necessity, too many proud men broken by the realities of debt and obligation. "Hope is sleeping soundly," she said, changing the subject. "And the bread is done. Would you like some? It's best when it's fresh." Thatcher's expression softened marginally. "I would thank you. It smells like heaven itself." The simple meal of fresh bread, butter, and coffee seemed to restore something in both of them, a reminder that regardless of banknotes and past tragedies, life continued with its basic rhythms and needs. They ate in companionable silence, the earlier tension between them temporarily set aside in the face of Blackwood's more immediate threat. "He mentioned something else," Alma said, finally breaking the quiet. "Something about the land itself being valuable." Thatcher looked up sharply. "What exactly did he say?" "Nothing specific. Just an implication that the property was particularly desirable beyond its obvious use as a ranch." Thatcher's brow furrowed. "That's interesting. I've wondered why he's been so persistent about this place. There are larger, more established ranches in the territory that would be better investments." "Perhaps it's personal," Alma suggested. "Some men enjoy the power of taking what others value." "Perhaps." But Thatcher didn't look convinced. "Or perhaps there's something here I'm not seeing." He stood his meal forgotten. "I need to check the property and see if there's anything I've overlooked." As he moved to a trunk in the corner of the room, Hope's cry came from the nursery. Alma rose to tend to her, leaving Thatcher to his investigation. By the time she returned with a freshly changed and fed Hope, he had spread several yellowed papers across the table, his expression intent as he studied them. "Find anything?" she asked, shifting Hope to her shoulder. "Nothing obvious," Thatcher admitted. "Just the usual boundaries, water rights to the creek." He ran a finger along a line on the map. "The property extends to the ridgeline here, includes the south pasture and the small stand of timber by the creek." Alma peered at the map, noting the neatly drawn boundaries and natural features. "What's this?" she asked, pointing to a symbol near the western edge of the property. "Old mine shaft," Thatcher explained. "Played out years ago, according to the previous owner. I've never even seen it. It's in the most remote part of the property up in the hills." "Could there be something valuable there? Something Blackwood knows about?" Thatcher considered this, his expression thoughtful. "It's possible, I suppose. There were rumors of silver in these hills years ago, but nothing substantial ever came of it." He shook his head. "It's a long shot, but worth investigating when the weather improves." Hope made a small, discontented sound, and Alma automatically began to rock, a gentle swaying motion that quieted the baby. "She's restless today," she observed, perhaps sensing the disruption to her routine. Thatcher's expression softened as he looked at his daughter. "Clara always said babies know more than we give them credit for, that they feel the emotions around them, even if they don't understand them." "Your wife sounds like a wise woman," Alma said. "She was." Thatcher's voice held a quiet reverence. "Too good for the likes of me, that's certain." Alma studied him, noting the grief that still shadowed his features when he spoke of Clara. "I doubt she would have agreed with that assessment." Thatcher looked up, surprised by the gentle defense. "No, she wouldn't have. Clara had a way of seeing the best in people, even when they couldn't see it themselves. He folded the maps carefully, returning them to the trunk. I should check the barn before dark. The temperature's dropping again. Left alone with hope, Alma found herself reflecting on the unexpected turns her life had taken. A month ago, she would never have imagined herself in Thatcher Sullivan's home, caring for his child, concerned about his financial troubles. Yet here she was, increasingly entangled in the life of a man who was by rights at least partially responsible for her husband's death, and indirectly for the loss of her sons. Life makes little sense sometimes, doesn't it? She murmured to Hope, who gazed up at her with unfocused eyes. The paths we walk, the people we meet along the way, none of it follows any plan we can discern. Hope's only response was to grasp Alma's finger with surprising strength, a gesture that sent an unexpected pang through her heart. This child, innocent of all the complicated history between the adults in her life, had somehow begun to matter to Alma in a way she hadn't anticipated. It was dangerous, this growing attachment, this softening of the protective shell she'd built around her heart after losing her sons. Yet she couldn't seem to stop it any more than she could stop the sun from rising or the seasons from changing. And perhaps she admitted to herself in the quiet of the afternoon she didn't truly want to. The next morning dawned even colder, the temperature having plummeted overnight until the very air seemed brittle with frost. Alma rose early, stoking the fire to chase away the chill before attending to Hope's first feeding of the day. Thatcher was already gone, having mentioned at supper the previous night that he needed to ride to the north pasture to check on a section of fence damaged in the last storm. As she moved about the kitchen, preparing breakfast and warming milk for Hope, Alma found herself falling into a routine that felt both foreign and strangely familiar. The house was beginning to feel less like a place where she merely worked and more like a space she inhabited, with all the complex emotions that entailed. The sound of approaching horses drew her to the window. Two riders were coming up the lane, their breath and that of their mounts creating clouds of vapor in the frigid air. As they drew closer, Alma recognized one as Robertson, whose farm lay to the east of Sullivan Ranch. The other was unfamiliar, a younger man with a lean build and city clothes ill-suited to the winter weather. Alma hesitated, uncertain whether to answer the door as she had with Blackwood. Before she could decide, a sharp knock sounded, followed by Robertson's voice. "Hello, the house. Anyone home?" With a sigh, Alma wiped her hands on her apron and went to the door. Robertson was a good man, one of the few in Silver Creek who had always treated her with respect. He'd even defended her once when some of the more narrow-minded townsfolk had made disparaging remarks about her heritage. "Mr. Robertson," she greeted him, opening the door. "Mr. Sullivan isn't here at present." "Mrs. Freeman." Robertson removed his hat, revealing thinning gray hair. "Didn't expect to find you here, but I'm glad of it. This here's Marcus Porter, new lawyer in town. We need a word if you don't mind." Alma glanced at Porter, noting his intelligent eyes and the way he too removed his hat respectfully. "Please come in," she said, stepping aside. "The fire's warm, and there's coffee if you'd like some." "Much obliged," Robertson said, stamping snow from his boots before entering. Porter followed his gaze, taking in the modest interior of the Sullivan home with interest. "I apologize for the intrusion, Mrs. Freeman," Porter said, his accent marking him as educated, possibly from back east. "But the matter is somewhat urgent, and Mr. Robertson thought it best not to wait for Mr. Sullivan's return." Alma gestured for them to sit at the table while she poured coffee. "May I ask what this is about?" Robertson and Porter exchanged glances, a silent communication that raised Alma's curiosity. It was Porter who finally spoke, his voice measured and precise. "I've recently arrived in Silver Creek to establish a legal practice," he began. "In the course of setting up my office, I've been reviewing property records, land grants, and various legal documents pertaining to the area." He accepted the cup Alma offered with a nod of thanks. "I came across something regarding Sullivan Ranch." "Concerning?" Alma prompted when he paused. "Yes, it appears there may be irregularities in the loan agreement between Mr. Sullivan and Harlan Blackwood." Porter reached into his coat, withdrawing a folded document. "Mr. Robertson mentioned that Blackwood has been pressuring Sullivan about the note coming due, which prompted me to look more closely at the paperwork." Robertson leaned forward, his weathered face serious. "Marcus here thinks Blackwood's up to his old tricks. Wouldn't be the first time." "What sort of tricks?" Alma asked, her suspicion aroused by the mention of Blackwood. Porter spread the document on the table, a copy of a loan agreement with Thatcher's signature at the bottom. The terms of this loan are unusual to say the least. The interest rate is exorbitant, well beyond what would be considered reasonable even in this territory. And there's a clause here, he pointed to a section of small print, that allows Blackwood to demand immediate payment under certain conditions, regardless of the originally agreed upon date. Alma frowned, trying to make sense of the legal terminology. What conditions? That's the concerning part, Porter said. The language is deliberately vague. It refers to changes in the borrower's circumstances that may affect repayment capability, without specifying what those changes might be. Like the death of a spouse, Alma suggested the implications becoming clear. Porter nodded grimly. Exactly. Under this clause, Blackwood could argue that Mrs. Sullivan's death constitutes a material change in circumstances, allowing him to call in the loan immediately, rather than waiting for the spring thaw. That's despicable, Alma said, her opinion of Blackwood already low sinking further. It's also potentially illegal, Porter added, or at the very least ethically questionable enough that a judge might invalidate the clause if it were challenged in court. Robertson cleared his throat. There's more to it, though. Tell her what you found about the railway Marcus. Porter took a sip of coffee before continuing. I've been corresponding with associates in Helena about various matters. One mentioned that the territorial legislature is considering a bill to fund a new railway spur connecting Silver Creek to the main line at Helena. He paused, letting the information sink in. The proposed route would pass directly through Sullivan Ranch, specifically across the western section, where there's a natural pass through the hills. Alma's mind raced, connecting the pieces. And if the railway bill passes, the value of that land would increase tenfold overnight, Porter confirmed. Any property owner along the route would be in a position to negotiate very favorable terms with the railway company for right-of-way access. And Blackwood knows this, Alma concluded. That's why he's so eager to acquire the ranch. It's the only explanation that makes sense. Robertson agreed. He's been buying up smaller properties all through the territory over the past year. Most folks thought he was just expanding his holdings, but now it appears he's been acquiring strategic parcels along the proposed railway route, Porter finished, including, if he succeeds, Sullivan Ranch. Alma sat back, absorbing the implications. If what Porter and Robertson were suggesting was true, Blackwood wasn't merely being opportunistic in pressing Thatcher about the loan. He was actively scheming to take advantage of the situation to strip Thatcher of his property just before it became vastly more valuable. Mr. Sullivan needs to know about this, she said firmly. That's why we're here, Robertson agreed. Figured he ought to have all the facts before Blackwood pushes him into any hasty decisions. He rode out to the north pasture early this morning, Alma told them. I'm not certain when he'll return. Porter folded the document, returning it to his coat. I can come back tomorrow if that would be more convenient. In the meantime, I'll continue looking into the matter, see if there are other aspects of Blackwood's dealings that might be relevant. A sudden cry from the nursery announced that Hope was awake and ready for attention. Alma excused herself to tend to the baby, returning moments later with Hope cradled against her shoulder. Robertson's face softened at the sight of the infant. So, this is Sullivan's little girl. Heard she arrived under difficult circumstances. He shook his head sympathetically. Terrible thing losing a wife that way. My Martha nearly died with our second. Can't imagine if she had. Porter, meanwhile, was regarding Hope with evident fascination. I've never been around babies much, he admitted. She's so small. But surprisingly resilient, Alma said, a faint smile touching her lips. Would you like to hold her? Porter looked startled by the offer. I wouldn't know how. It's not so difficult. Just support her head and keep her close to your body. Without waiting for further protest, Alma gently transferred Hope to Porter's arms, adjusting his hold until the baby was secure. The young lawyer looked down at Hope with an expression of wonder and mild terror, as if he'd been handed something immeasurably precious and dangerously fragile. Hope, for her part, regarded him with solemn curiosity before yawning widely. I believe she finds you rather unexciting, Mr. Porter. Alma observed the hint of a tease in her voice. Porter chuckled, relaxing slightly. A common reaction to lawyers, I'm afraid. Robertson watched the exchange with undisguised amusement. You've got a natural way with little ones, Mrs. Freeman. Always did as I recall. Your boys were the best behaved children in Silver Creek. The mention of her son sent a familiar pang through Alma's heart, but it was less sharp than it might have been even a week ago. They were good boys, she agreed softly, though I wouldn't call them well-behaved all the time. Elijah especially had a gift for finding trouble. Children should have a bit of spirit, Robertson said. Shows they're thinking for themselves. Hope began to fuss and Porter looked relieved when Alma reclaimed her. I think she's hungry, Alma explained. Her bottle is nearly ready in the kitchen. Taking the hint, Robertson stood reaching for his hat. We'll be on our way then. When Sullivan returns, tell him I'll be back tomorrow with Marcus here. We can discuss the situation more fully then. I will, Alma promised. And thank you both of you for bringing this information. It matters to me that Mr. Sullivan isn't taken advantage of. Something in her tone must have revealed more than she intended, for Robertson gave her a long, thoughtful look before nodding. Good people look out for each other, Mrs. Freeman. That's all there is to it. After they had gone, Alma stood by the window feeding Hope and watching the two men ride away. The baby's weight in her arms was comforting, a solid reality in a world that suddenly seemed more complicated than she had anticipated when she first agreed to help Thatcher Sullivan. The revelation about Blackwood's scheming had stirred something in her, a sense of injustice, yes, but also something more personal. She found herself genuinely concerned for Thatcher's welfare, for his ability to keep his promise to Clara that Hope would grow up in this home. It was an unexpected shift in her feelings, one she wasn't entirely comfortable with, but couldn't seem to deny. Your father has more troubles than he deserves, she told Hope softly, though I suppose that's true of most of us in this life. Hope merely continued to suckle at her bottle, unconcerned with the complexities of adult problems. Alma envied her that simplicity, that pure focus on immediate needs without worry for the past or future. The remainder of the day passed quietly. Alma busied herself with household tasks, laundering the growing pile of baby linens, preparing a stew for supper, mending a tear in one of Thatcher's shirts. The domestic activities gave her a sense of purpose, a feeling of contributing something tangible to the well-being of this makeshift household. It was nearly dusk when Thatcher finally returned, his face reddened by cold and his movements stiff as he dismounted in the yard. Alma watched from the window as he tended to his horse, noting the careful thoroughness with which he rubbed the animal down and ensured it had feed and water before seeing to his own comfort. When he entered the house, the scent of cold air and horses clinging to his clothes, Alma had a hot cup of coffee waiting. You look half frozen, she observed, handing him the steaming cup. Thatcher accepted it gratefully, his gloved hands curling around the warmth. Feels that way too, he admitted. The north fence was worse than I thought. Spent most of the day repairing it. You had visitors while you were gone, Alma told him, returning to the stove to check on the stew. Mr. Robertson and a lawyer named Porter. Thatcher paused in the act of removing his coat. A lawyer, what did they want? Alma stirred the stew, considering how best to relay the information. They've discovered something about your loan agreement with Blackwood, something that might explain his eagerness to acquire your property. She glanced over her shoulder at Thatcher. They'll return tomorrow to discuss it with you directly, but the essence is that there may be a railway line planned to pass through your land. Thatcher's expression shifted from surprise to thoughtful consideration. A railway, that would explain a lot. He hung his coat by the door and moved to stand near the fire, holding his hands out to the warmth. Did they mention anything specific about the loan itself? Only that there's a clause allowing Blackwood to demand immediate payment under certain conditions, including changes in your circumstances. Alma ladled stew into a bowl, setting it on the table. Mr. Porter believes it may not be legally enforceable. Thatcher sat at the table, his weariness evident in the slump of his shoulders. That would be a stroke of luck we sorely need. He glanced toward the nursery. How's Hope today? Well enough. She's sleeping now, but she'll be up for a feeding soon. Alma joined him at the table, her own bowl of stew steaming before her. She's a strong baby, resilient. Like her mother, Thatcher said softly. He took a spoonful of stew, closing his eyes briefly in appreciation. This is good. Thank you. They ate in companionable silence for a time, the only sounds the crackling of the fire and the occasional clink of spoons against bowls. It was a domestic scene, ordinary in its details, yet extraordinary in its context, a widow and a widower connected by tragedy and circumstance, finding a temporary peace in shared, simple comforts. I've been thinking, Thatcher said, finally breaking the silence. About what you said yesterday regarding promises being difficult to keep. Alma looked up, waiting for him to continue. You're right, of course. Life has a way of undermining our best intentions. He set down his spoon, his expression serious. But I've also been thinking about the promises we make to ourselves, the ones that define who we are regardless of circumstances. And what promises have you made to yourself, Mr. Sullivan? Alma asked, genuinely curious. Thatcher seemed to consider the question carefully. After the war, I promised myself I'd live in a way that honored the men who didn't come home, that I'd build something worthwhile, something that would last. He glanced toward the window where the fading light illuminated the snow-covered landscape of his ranch. This place became that something. Not just land and livestock, but a home, a future. Alma nodded, understanding the depth of meaning the ranch held for him. It wasn't merely property or livelihood, it was purpose, identity, the physical manifestation of his values and hopes. And you, Mrs. Freeman, Thatcher asked, turning the question back to her, what promises have you made to yourself? The question caught Alma off guard. It had been so long since anyone had asked about her own aspirations, her own inner life beyond the roles of widow and bereaved mother. She was silent for a moment, searching for an answer that felt true. After I lost my family, she said slowly, I promised myself I wouldn't become bitter, that I wouldn't let grief hollow me out completely. She met his gaze directly. I haven't always succeeded. You're here, aren't you? Thatcher said simply. Helping a man who, by your own admission, bears some responsibility for your husband's death. I'd say that shows remarkable absence of bitterness. Alma looked away, uncomfortable with the perception of virtue in what had been initially at least a decision born of financial necessity and a reluctant sense of duty toward an innocent child. I came for hope, she reminded him, not for you. Even so. Thatcher's voice held no resentment at her bluntness. It couldn't have been an easy choice. Before Alma could respond, Hope's cry came from the nursery, a timely interruption to a conversation that was venturing into territory too personal, too revealing. I'll tend to her, Alma said, rising from the table. You should rest. Tomorrow will likely bring its own challenges with Robertson and Porter returning. Thatcher nodded, though he remained seated, his expression thoughtful as Alma moved toward the nursery. She could feel his gaze following her, and something in it, some quality of genuine seeing, made her both uneasy and oddly warmed. In the nursery, Alma lifted Hope from her cradle, inhaling the sweet milk scent of her. Your father is a complicated man, little one, she murmured, echoing her words from earlier in the day. And I'm beginning to think I may be in trouble here. Hope merely blinked up at her, innocent of the complexities swirling around the adults in her life. Alma envied her that simplicity, even as she found herself increasingly entangled in a situation she had never anticipated when she first agreed to help care for Thatcher Sullivan's newborn daughter. The night brought with it a fresh snowfall, silent and steady, blanketing the world in white. Alma woke several times to tend to Hope, padding quietly through the darkened house with the baby in her arms. During one such midnight feeding, she found Thatcher sitting by the fire, a book open on his lap, but his gaze fixed on the flames. Couldn't sleep, she asked softly, settling into the rocking chair with Hope. Thatcher looked up, seemingly unsurprised by her presence. Too much on my mind, he admitted, thinking about what Porter and Robertson might have discovered about Blackwood's plans for my land. Alma nodded, understanding. It's good that they have uncovered this now before Blackwood could proceed any further with his scheme. If it is a scheme, Thatcher cautioned, we don't have all the facts yet. True enough. Alma adjusted Hope's position slightly as the baby continued to nurse from her bottle. But it would explain his eagerness to acquire your property, his insistence on that unusual clause in the loan agreement. Thatcher nodded, his expression grim. Blackwood's always been shrewd in business, but I never thought him underhanded. Shows how poor a judge of character I can be. We all misjudge people at times, Alma said, thinking of her own initial assessment of Thatcher himself. It's part of being human. A comfortable silence fell between them, broken only by the occasional pop from the fire and Hope's soft sounds as she fed. There was something intimate about sharing this quiet midnight hour, something that felt both dangerous and right. I've been meaning to ask, Thatcher said, finally, his voice low to avoid disturbing the peaceful atmosphere. The song you sing to Hope sometimes, the spiritual, what are the words I only ever hear you humming it? Alma hesitated, surprised by the request. The songs of her childhood, of her grandmother's knee, were private things, connections to a heritage she rarely shared with outsiders. You don't have to tell me, Thatcher added quickly, sensing her reluctance. I was just curious. It seems to soothe her so effectively. It's called Wade in the Water, Alma said after a moment. It's It was a song with hidden meanings during slavery times, directions disguised as worship. Thatcher's expression showed genuine interest. I'd like to hear it sometime. The whole song, I mean, if you wouldn't mind. Alma considered the request, weighing her private nature against the simple human connection being offered. Perhaps someday, she said finally, when the time is right. Thatcher nodded, accepting her partial refusal without offense. I'll look forward to it. The exchange, simple as it was, felt significant, a small step toward a trust that neither of them had expected to develop when Alma first arrived at Sullivan Ranch. As Hope finished her bottle and drifted back to sleep, Alma found herself wondering what other unexpected developments might lie ahead in this strange, improvised arrangement they had created. The next morning brought clear skies and a biting cold that made the snow creak underfoot. Thatcher spent the early hours in the barn tending to the livestock and making repairs to equipment, while Alma managed the household and cared for Hope. By mid-morning, they had fallen into an easy rhythm, moving around each other with a growing familiarity that neither commented on but both felt. When Robertson and Porter arrived shortly after noon, Thatcher met them at the door, his manner polite but guarded. Alma had prepared coffee and a simple lunch, anticipating a lengthy discussion that might require sustenance. Mr. Sullivan, Porter greeted him, extending a gloved hand. Marcus Porter, I appreciate you taking the time to meet with us. Seems I'd be a fool not to, given what Mrs. Freeman has told me of your discoveries, Thatcher replied, shaking the offered hand before turning to Robertson. Frank, good to see you. Likewise, Sullivan, Robertson clapped him on the shoulder. Though I wish it were under better circumstances. The men settled at the table where Alma had laid out the meal. She hesitated, uncertain whether to join them or retreat to the nursery with Hope, who was contentedly gnawing on her own fist in her cradle nearby. Please join us, Mrs. Freeman, Porter said, noticing her hesitation. Your insights might be valuable given your knowledge of the local community. Thatcher nodded agreement. Yes, please stay. This concerns all of us now. Alma took a seat, somewhat surprised by the inclusion, but not displeased. Porter wasted no time in presenting what he had learned, spreading several documents on the table and explaining the connections he had discovered between Blackwood's recent property acquisitions and the proposed railway route. It's not definitive proof of wrongdoing, he cautioned, but the pattern is suspicious, to say the least. Blackwood has acquired or attempted to acquire properties along this line. He traced a route on a territorial map, which corresponds almost exactly with the proposed railway spur. And Sullivan Ranch is the largest parcel along that route, Robertson added. Without it, the railway would have to take a much longer, more costly path around these hills. Thatcher studied the map, his expression thoughtful. So Blackwood knew about this railway plan when he offered me the loan. He was setting me up to fail, planning to foreclose and take the land just before its value increased dramatically. That would be my assessment, Porter agreed. And the unusual clause in your loan agreement supports this theory. It gives him the flexibility to call in the loan whenever it's most advantageous to him, rather than adhering to the standard terms. Can he get away with that? Thatcher asked. Legally, I mean. Porter's expression was cautiously optimistic. I believe we have grounds to challenge the clause, particularly if we can demonstrate that Blackwood possessed information about the railway that he deliberately withheld from you when negotiating the loan. That'll be the hard part, Robertson interjected, proving he knew. Perhaps, Porter conceded, but I've been making inquiries. Blackwood sits on several territorial committees, including one that would have had early access to the railway planning documents. Alma, who had been listening intently, spoke up. What about the bank itself? Wouldn't there be records of his involvement with these committees or correspondence about the railway plans? Porter looked at her with new respect. Excellent point, Mrs. Freeman. If we could access such records, they would significantly strengthen our case. And how exactly would we do that? Thatcher asked skeptically. Blackwood's not likely to hand over incriminating documents if we ask politely. No, Porter agreed. But banks are required to maintain certain records for regulatory purposes. With a judge's order, he could potentially gain access to relevant correspondence and meeting minutes. That's assuming we can find a judge who isn't in Blackwood's pocket, Robertson said grimly. Judge Hollister in Helena is known for his independence, Porter countered, and he has a particular interest in cases involving potential abuse of financial power. The discussion continued through lunch with Porter outlining potential legal strategies and the evidence they would need to gather. Throughout, Alma observed Thatcher, noting the way hope and determination gradually replaced the defeated look he had worn when discussing the loan with her the previous day. As the meal concluded, Porter gathered his documents summarizing their next steps. "I'll draft a petition to Judge Hollister requesting access to Blackwood's bank records. In the meantime, Mr. Sullivan, I suggest you gather any correspondence or documents related to your loan agreement." "And what about immediate concerns?" Alma asked, practical as always. "If Blackwood decides to invoke that clause and demand immediate payment, what then?" "We can file for an injunction," Porter explained, "a temporary order preventing him from taking any action regarding the property until the court has reviewed the case. It won't solve the underlying issue, but it will buy us time." Thatcher nodded, his expression resolute. "Time is all I need. If this railway deal is real and if we can prevent Blackwood from taking the ranch before it's announced publicly, I can negotiate directly with the railway company for right-of-way access. The payment would more than cover what I owe Blackwood." "Exactly," Porter confirmed, "and that I suspect is precisely what Blackwood is trying to prevent. He wants to be the one negotiating that lucrative deal." As the men prepared to depart, Hope began to fuss, requiring Alma's attention. She lifted the baby from her cradle, soothing her with gentle bounces while continuing to listen to the conversation. "You've got a fighter there," Robertson commented, nodding toward Hope. "Sullivan's spirit through and through. And her mother's determination," Thatcher added softly, his gaze lingering on his daughter, with a mixture of pride and wistfulness. Porter, observing the exchange, seemed to come to a decision. "Mr. Sullivan, I'd like to take your case, not just as a legal matter, but as a personal commitment. What Blackwood is attempting is not merely sharp business practice, it's exploitation of a family's tragedy for financial gain." He glanced at Hope, then back to Thatcher. "I find that particularly offensive." Thatcher extended his hand. "I'd be grateful for your help, Mr. Porter, but I should warn you I can't offer much in the way of payment until this matter is resolved." Porter shook the offered hand firmly. "We'll work something out, perhaps a small piece of that railway right-of-way payment when it comes through." He smiled, the expression transforming his serious face. "I believe in investing in the future, Mr. Sullivan. Yours and Hope's." After the men had gone, Thatcher stood at the window watching their horses disappear down the snow-covered lane. His posture was straighter than it had been in days, the burden of uncertain fate somewhat lightened by the prospect of a fight he might actually win. "You seem encouraged," Alma observed, still holding Hope. Thatcher turned to face her, a cautious optimism in his eyes. "I am. For the first time since Clara died, I feel like I might be able to keep my promise to her after all." He moved closer, reaching out to brush a gentle finger against Hope's cheek. "This is her home, and no one, not Harlan Blackwood, not anyone, is going to take it from her." The conviction in his voice stirred something in Alma, a recognition of the fierce protective love of a parent that she understood all too well. It was the same love that had driven her to try to pull Isaiah from the burning barn, that had kept her going through the devastating loss of her sons, that had initially made her reluctant to form any attachment to Hope for fear of experiencing such pain again. Yet here she was, holding this child with growing affection, increasingly invested in the future of a family not her own. It was unexpected, unplanned, and potentially unwise. But as Hope curled her tiny fingers around Alma's scarred hand, Alma acknowledged to herself that it was also perhaps unavoidable. "She's lucky to have such a determined father," she said softly, "and such a capable caretaker." Thatcher replied, his gaze meeting hers with a warmth that sent an unexpected flutter through Alma's chest. For a moment they stood together, connected by the child between them and by a growing understanding that neither had anticipated. Then Hope squirmed, breaking the moment, and life continued with its practical demands and immediate needs. But something had shifted subtly but significantly. A new possibility had entered the quiet ranch house, one that neither Alma nor Thatcher was ready to name, but that both felt with increasing clarity as the winter days passed and spring's thaw, with all its promises and challenges, drew ever closer. February gave way to March, bringing with it the first tentative signs of spring. The snow began to melt in patches, revealing glimpses of dormant grass beneath. The creek that ran through Sullivan Ranch swelled with meltwater, its ice breaking up in dramatic crashes that echoed across the valley. And in the small ranch house, another kind of thawing was taking place, less visible, but no less profound. Hope was now 2 months old, growing stronger daily. Her face had lost the generic newborn appearance and was developing distinct features. Clara's delicate nose, Thatcher's determined chin, and eyes that were shifting from newborn blue to a deeper shade that hinted at her mother's coloring. She had become more alert, tracking movement with growing coordination and responding to voices with what almost resembled smiles. Alma, whose initial commitment had been for only a week, had stayed on, her presence in the Sullivan household, evolving from temporary arrangement to something that felt increasingly permanent. She and Thatcher had settled into a comfortable routine, each taking responsibility for certain aspects of ranch and home life, moving around each other with the easy familiarity of people who have learned to coexist in shared space. But beneath this domestic tranquility ran currents of tension and unresolved emotion. The looming confrontation with Blackwood, the uncertain future of the ranch, and the complex feelings developing between Alma and Thatcher all simmered beneath the surface of their daily interactions, acknowledged but rarely discussed directly. On a surprisingly mild afternoon in mid-March, Alma sat on the porch, Hope cradled in her arms. The baby was wrapped snugly against the lingering chill, but the sun was warm enough that Alma had felt compelled to bring her outside to let her feel the fresh air and see the wide Montana sky. "This is your home," Alma told the infant softly. "Your land, your heritage. Your father is fighting to keep it for you, little one." Hope gazed up at her with solemn eyes, one tiny hand escaping the blanket to wave in the air. Alma caught it, gently smiling as the baby's fingers curled reflexively around her own. "You've got a strong grip," she observed. "You'll need that strength in this world." From the barn came the sound of hammering as Thatcher worked on repairs that had been postponed through the worst of winter. The rhythmic sound was oddly comforting, the reminder of life continuing, of rebuilding and renewal after loss. The creak of wagon wheels drew Alma's attention to the lane where a horse-drawn cart was approaching. As it drew closer, she recognized Martha Robertson, Frank's wife, a kind-faced woman in her 50s who had always been among the more welcoming residents of Silver Creek. "Mrs. Freeman," Martha called, waving as the cart came to a stop in the yard. "I thought I might find you here." Alma rose, adjusting Hope in her arms. "Mrs. Robertson, this is a pleasant surprise." Martha climbed down from the cart with the ease of a woman accustomed to farm work despite her advancing years. "Frank told me about the situation with Blackwood," she explained, retrieving a basket from the cart. "Thought you might appreciate some fresh eggs and preserves. Our hens are laying well now that the days are lengthening." "That's very kind," Alma said, genuinely touched by the gesture. "Please come inside. I just put coffee on." Martha followed her into the house, her gaze taking in the changes Alma had made over the past weeks. Curtains washed and rehung floors swept and polished, the general air of neglect that had pervaded the place after Clara's death, now replaced by modest but noticeable comforts. "You've done wonders with the place," Martha observed, setting her basket on the table. "It has a feeling of home again." Alma felt a flush of pride, though she tried to dismiss it. It needed a woman's touch, that's all. Mr. Sullivan had more pressing matters to attend to. Martha's eyes twinkled knowingly. "Mr. Sullivan, is it still so formal after all these weeks?" "It's a professional arrangement," Alma reminded her, though the words sounded hollow even to her own ears. "Of course it is," Martha agreed in a tone that suggested she believed nothing of the sort. She reached for Hope. "May I? It's been an age since I held a baby." Alma transferred Hope to Martha's capable arms, moving to pour coffee for them both. Martha cooed at the infant, rocking slightly in the instinctive way of women who have raised children of their own. "She's thriving," Martha noted. "Strong and alert. You've done well by her, Alma." "She's a good baby," Alma replied. "Makes my job easy." Martha looked up from Hope's face, her expression turning serious. "It's more than a job, though, isn't it? I can see it in the way you look at her, in the way you've made this house a home." Alma busied herself with the coffee cups, uncomfortable with Martha's perceptiveness. "I care for her, of course. Any woman would. Any woman with a heart like yours, perhaps." Martha settled into a chair, still holding Hope. "Frank tells me this lawyer Porter has a solid case against Blackwood, that there's a good chance Thatcher will keep the ranch." "Mr. Porter seems confident," Alma agreed, joining Martha at the table. But Blackwood is powerful with many connections. It won't be an easy fight. Few worthwhile things are easy, Martha observed. She studied Alma's face for a moment. What will you do when it's resolved? Will you stay? The question caught Alma off guard, though it was one she had been asking herself with increasing frequency as the weeks passed. I haven't decided, she admitted. My arrangement with Mr. Sullivan was always meant to be temporary, until Hope was older, more established in her routines. And now she is, Martha noted. Yet you're still here. Yes. Alma couldn't quite meet the older woman's knowing gaze. I suppose I am. Martha shifted Hope to her shoulder, patting the baby's back gently. Frank says Thatcher is a changed man since you came. Less haunted, more purposeful. That's the effect of having a child to care for, Alma suggested. It gives one focused direction. Perhaps, Martha allowed, or perhaps it's having someone to share the burden with. Someone who understands loss, who knows how to keep going despite it. Before Alma could respond, the door opened and Thatcher entered, bringing with him the scent of fresh air and sawdust. He stopped short at the sight of Martha's surprise registering on his face before he recovered his manners. Mrs. Robertson, he greeted her, removing his hat. This is an unexpected pleasure. I was just telling Alma that I brought some eggs and preserves, Martha said, smiling warmly, and getting acquainted with this little beauty. She nodded toward Hope, who had fallen asleep against her shoulder. That's very kind of you, Thatcher said. His gaze moved to Alma, a silent question in his eyes. Mrs. Robertson's husband told her about the situation with Blackwood, Alma explained. She came to offer support. Thatcher's expression softened. We appreciate it truly. It's good to know we have friends in the community. More than you might think, Martha assured him. Blackwood isn't as well liked as he believes himself to be. Many in Silver Creek remember how he foreclosed on the Hendersons during that drought year, and the rumors about how he acquired the Miller property have never quite died down. Mr. Porter, the lawyer, mentioned something similar, Thatcher said, pouring himself a cup of coffee. He thinks Blackwood's reputation might work against him if the case goes before a judge. Let's pray it does, Martha said fervently. She rose carefully, transferring the sleeping Hope back to Alma. I should be getting back. Frank will be wondering what's keeping me. As Thatcher saw Martha to the door, thanking her again for the provisions, Alma remained seated, Hope warm and solid against her chest. Martha's question echoed in her mind. What will you do when it's resolved? Will you stay? The truth was, Alma didn't know. The thought of leaving Hope, and yes, Thatcher too, created an ache in her chest that surprised her with its intensity. Yet staying meant acknowledging that something had changed within her, that the boundaries she had established to protect herself after losing her family were no longer as firm as they once had been. Thatcher returned from seeing Martha off, his expression thoughtful. The Robertsons are good people, he observed, reclaiming his coffee cup. Always have been. Yes, Alma agreed. Martha was telling me that there's considerable support for you in the community regarding the dispute with Blackwood. Porter said the same. Thatcher nodded. He's been talking to people in town, gathering statements about Blackwood's business practices over the years, building a case. He sat across from Alma, his gaze settling on Hope's sleeping form. It gives me hope, knowing we're not fighting this battle alone. Alma noted his use of we rather than I, but chose not to comment on it. The subtle shift in language reflected a larger change in their situation. What had begun as Thatcher's personal struggle had somehow become a shared concern. I've been meaning to ask, Thatcher said after a moment, his tone carefully casual. Your arrangement here, that is your agreement to help with Hope. It was originally for a short time, but it's been nearly 2 months now. Alma looked up, meeting his gaze directly. Are you asking if I plan to leave Mr. Sullivan? Thatcher, he corrected automatically. And yes, I suppose I am. Not that I want you to, he added quickly. Hope has thrived under your care, and he paused, seeming to search for the right words. I've come to value your presence here. Very much. The simple admission hung in the air between them, carrying more weight than its plain language might suggest. Alma found herself studying Thatcher's face, the lines at the corners of his eyes, the strength in his jaw, the way his expression opened when he spoke of Hope, or increasingly when he looked at Alma herself. I have no immediate plans to leave, she said finally. Hope still needs consistent care, and the situation with Blackwood remains unresolved. It would seem irresponsible to depart in the midst of such uncertainty. Relief flickered across Thatcher's features, followed by something that might have been disappointment at the practical nature of her response. "Of course," he said, "your sense of responsibility is one of your finest qualities, Mrs. Freeman." "Alma," she corrected, surprising herself. "If I'm to stay, perhaps we can dispense with the formalities." A slow smile spread across Thatcher's face, warming his eyes. "Alma," he repeated, as if testing the sound of her name on his tongue. "Thank you for staying, for everything you've done for Hope, for us." Again, that word us, implying a unit, a family, something Alma had believed was lost to her forever after the deaths of Isaiah and her sons. The idea both frightened and attracted her, like standing at the edge of a precipice, knowing the danger of falling, yet unable to resist the pull of the view. Hope stirred against her chest, making small sounds that presaged waking. The moment of intimacy passed as Alma shifted her attention to the baby, checking her diaper and preparing for the inevitable feeding that would be required soon. Thatcher seemed to sense her need for distance, rising from the table. "I should finish the repairs on the east stall," he said. "The mare's due to foal any day now, and I want to be sure she has a proper place." Alma nodded, grateful for the return to practical matters. "Supper will be ready at the usual time," she told him. "I'm using some of the eggs Mrs. Robertson brought." "Looking forward to it," Thatcher said, and there was warmth in his voice that had nothing to do with the promised meal. After he had gone, Alma sat for a long time, Hope now awake and contentedly gnawing on her fist. The conversation with Martha, followed by the exchange with Thatcher, had brought to the surface questions and feelings she had been carefully avoiding for weeks. "What am I doing here?" she whispers to Hope. "What am I becoming?" The baby offered no answers, merely gazed up at Alma with trusting eyes that seemed to say that whatever Alma was becoming, Hope approved of it entirely. That night, after Hope had been settled and Thatcher had retired to his room, Alma sat by the fire, a piece of mending in her hands, though her fingers were still. The house was quiet, save for the occasional pop of burning wood and the soft sighs of the sleeping baby in the nearby cradle. In this stillness, Alma found her mind returning to the past, not to the recent tragedies of Isaiah's death and the loss of her sons, but further back to memories she had tucked away for safekeeping. She remembered her grandmother, a tall, dignified woman who had raised Alma after her mother's death. Grandma Freeman had been born into slavery, but had lived to see freedom, carrying with her, through that transition, a wealth of knowledge about herbs, healing, and the rhythms of the natural world. "We got two medicines," she used to tell Alma, "the ones that heal the body and the ones that heal the spirit. Most folks only recognize the first kind, but it's the second that does the deeper work." Alma had absorbed her grandmother's teachings, learning which plants could reduce fever, ease pain, or aid digestion. But she had also learned the less tangible remedies, the comfort of human touch, the healing power of song, the way certain stories could mend a broken heart. After her family's deaths, Alma had set aside much of this knowledge, too raw with grief to contemplate healing of any kind. But here in the quiet of the Sullivan home, with Hope's peaceful breathing as accompaniment, she found herself remembering, reconsidering. Perhaps the greatest wisdom her grandmother had shared was this: healing rarely came in the form or from the direction one expected. Sometimes it arrived disguised as a burden, a responsibility that seemed too heavy to bear, but ultimately strengthened the bearer. Like caring for a motherless infant, like finding oneself against all expectations, forming attachments to a widower whose property was connected to one's greatest loss. Alma's hands resumed their work, the needle flashing in the firelight as she mended a tear in one of Thatcher's shirts. The domestic task felt like a metaphor for what was happening within her, the careful repair of something torn, the patient restoration of wholeness through small, deliberate actions. "You were right, Grandma," she murmured to the quiet room. "Healing comes in unexpected ways." The next morning dawned clear and mild, another hint of the spring that was gradually asserting itself over winter's lingering grip. Alma was in the kitchen kneading dough for the day's bread when a rider appeared in the lane, Marcus Porter, his city clothes exchanged for more practical riding attire, though he still managed to look somewhat out of place in the rural setting. Thatcher met him at the door, greeting him with the growing ease of familiarity. "Porter, good to see you. Any news?" The young lawyer dismounted, his expression a mixture of excitement and concern. "Significant developments," he said. "I thought it best to deliver the information in person rather than trust it to a message." Alma, wiping flour from her hands, joined them on the porch. "Good morning, Mr. Porter. You look like you've ridden hard. There's coffee inside if you'd like some." Porter smiled gratefully. "Mrs. Freeman, that would be most welcome, thank you." Inside, gathered around the table with steaming cups before them, Porter shared his news. "I've been in Helena meeting with Judge Hollister," he began. "He's agreed to review our petition regarding Blackwood's loan practices and has issued a preliminary injunction preventing any foreclosure actions until the case can be properly heard." Thatcher's relief was palpable. "That's excellent news. When will the hearing take place?" "That's where matters become complicated," Porter admitted. "The judge's docket is full for the next several weeks. The earliest he can hear our case is late April." April. Thatcher's brow furrowed. "That's cutting it close. The thaw will be well underway by then, and Blackwood could argue that the original loan terms should apply." "True," Porter agreed, "but the injunction protects us until the hearing regardless of the season. Blackwood cannot take any action against the property in the meantime." "He won't be pleased about that," Alma observed. "No, he won't," Porter confirmed. "In fact, he's already showing signs of desperation. Which brings me to the second development." He reached into his coat, withdrawing a folded document. "This is a copy of a letter sent from the territorial legislature to the Silver Creek Town Council. It confirms that the railway spur project has been approved and that preliminary surveys will begin next month." Thatcher took the document, scanning it quickly. "So it's official. The railway is coming. And will pass directly through the western section of your property," Porter added, "which explains Blackwood's urgency. Once this information becomes public knowledge, your bargaining position with the railway company will be significantly strengthened. And Blackwood loses his opportunity to acquire the land at a fraction of its future value," Thatcher concluded. "Exactly." Porter sipped his coffee, his expression turning more serious. "But that's not all. There have been incidents in town. Rumors being spread about both of you." He glanced from Thatcher to Alma. "Unpleasant insinuations about the nature of your arrangement here." Alma felt heat rise in her cheeks, though whether from embarrassment or anger, she couldn't quite tell. "What kind of insinuations?" Porter looked uncomfortable. "The sort that small minds typically conjure when a man and woman live under the same roof without benefit of marriage, particularly when the woman in question is—" He trailed off, clearly reluctant to voice the racial component of the gossip. "Is colored," Alma finished for him, her voice steady despite the knot forming in her stomach. "You can say it, Mr. Porter. It's hardly news to me that some in Silver Creek disapprove of my presence here." "It's Blackwood," Thatcher said, his tone hardening. "He's trying to discredit us to undermine community support for our case against him." "That would be my assessment as well," Porter agreed. "And what's he get that?" "He's using whatever weapons come to hand, including social prejudice." "Well, he'll find that weapon less effective than he hopes," Thatcher declared, his gaze meeting Alma's with unwavering support. "I care nothing for gossip, and I suspect Mrs. Freeman feels the same." Alma nodded, though in truth the news troubled her more than she wanted to admit. She had experienced prejudice before. Of course it was an unavoidable aspect of life for someone of her heritage in America, even in the supposedly more progressive territories. But the idea that her presence might somehow damage Thatcher's standing in the community, might weaken his position against Blackwood, added a new layer of complication to an already complex situation. "There's one more thing," Porter said, his tone suggesting he had saved the most difficult news for last. "Blackwood has been making inquiries about the fire last summer. The one in which—" he glanced at Alma apologetically— "in which my husband died." She supplied, her voice remarkably calm despite the sudden chill that ran through her at the mention of that day. "Yes." Porter looked to Thatcher. "He's suggesting there might have been negligence involved. That proper safety measures weren't in place, that the barn's wiring was known to be faulty." Thatcher paled slightly. "Is he threatening legal action?" "Not directly," Porter said. "But he's clearly fishing for leverage, anything he can use to pressure you into settling the loan dispute on his terms." Alma's hands tightened around her coffee cup. The mention of the fire of Isaiah's death had triggered memories she had been trying to keep at bay. The smell of smoke, the heat of flames, the desperate attempts to reach her husband, the searing pain as her hands were burned in the effort. But even more disturbing was the realization that Blackwood was willing to use this tragedy as a tool to exploit her loss for his financial gain. The coldness of it, the calculated cruelty, sparked a rage she had not allowed herself to feel in months. "He has no right," she said, her voice low but intense. "No right to use Isaiah's death as a bargaining chip in his schemes." Thatcher reached across the table, his hand covering hers in a gesture of support that was becoming increasingly familiar. "He doesn't," he agreed, "and we won't let him get away with it." Porter watched this exchange with interest, noting the protective way Thatcher responded to Alma's distress and the manner in which she accepted his comfort. "I believe our best approach is to continue as planned," he said after a moment. "Gather evidence of Blackwood's prior knowledge of the railway project, build our case for the hearing, and maintain a united front against his attempts to divide us." "United we certainly are," Thatcher affirmed, his hand still covering Alma's. "Blackwood has underestimated his opposition if he thinks gossip or threats will deter us." Porter nodded, seemingly satisfied. "Good. I'll continue my preparations for the hearing. In the meantime, be cautious. Blackwood is a powerful man, accustomed to getting his way. He may become more desperate as he realizes his plans are unraveling." After Porter had departed, promising to return with any further developments, Thatcher and Alma remained at the table, the weight of the morning's revelations settling around them. Hope slept peacefully in her cradle, unaware of the complex adult concerns swirling through the household. "I'm sorry," Thatcher said, finally breaking the silence, "about Blackwood bringing up the fire about the gossip in town. You didn't ask for any of this when you agreed to help with Hope." "No," Alma agreed, "but life rarely asks our permission before complicating itself." She withdrew her hand from beneath his, not abruptly but with gentle firmness. "The gossip doesn't concern me. I've faced worse. But the fire, oh," she paused, struggling to articulate the tumult of emotions the topic aroused. "Using Isaiah's death that way, it's unconscionable." "It is," Thatcher agreed, his expression darkening. "And it makes me wonder if there's more to Blackwood's interest in this property than just the railway. His determination seems personal somehow." Alma considered this. "Perhaps it is. Have you had dealings with him before, besides the loan, I mean?" Thatcher shook his head. "Nothing significant. Clara's father knew him years ago, I believe. They had some business together in Colorado before we moved here. But I've never heard anything to suggest there was bad blood between them." "It might be worth looking into," Alma suggested. "If Blackwood's motivations are indeed personal, rather than purely financial understanding, them could give us an advantage." Thatcher nodded, struck once again by Alma's practical intelligence. "I'll ask Porter to make inquiries. Clara's father is still in Colorado running a stagecoach operation. He might have insights." They lapsed into silence again, each lost in thought. The morning sun streamed through the windows, illuminating dust motes in the air and casting a golden glow over the simple kitchen. Despite the troubling news Porter had brought, there was something almost peaceful about the moment, two people bound by circumstance and growing affection, facing a common challenge together. "Whatever Blackwood's plans," Thatcher said finally, "we'll face them as we have everything else, one day at a time with whatever strength we can muster." Alma looked at him, noting the determination in his jaw, the quiet confidence that had replaced the despair she had first encountered in him after Clara's death. "Yes," she agreed softly, "we will." The word hung between them, we, simple yet profound in its implications. Somewhere along the way, their separate struggles had become a shared journey, their individual griefs tempered by mutual understanding and purpose. Hope chose that moment to wake her cry, cutting through the emotional tension of the room and returning them both to the immediate practical concerns of caregiving. Alma rose to tend to her, grateful for the distraction from thoughts and feelings that were becoming increasingly difficult to navigate. As March progressed toward April, the land began to awaken from its winter slumber. The snow retreated to shaded hollows and north-facing slopes, while green shoots appeared in sunnier locations. The creek ran high and fast with meltwater, and birds returned from their southern sojourns, filling the air with song and the busy sounds of nest building. On the ranch, life continued with its daily rhythms: livestock to tend, repairs to complete a household, to maintain a baby to care for. But beneath these ordinary activities ran currents of anticipation and concern as the date for the hearing with Judge Hollister approached. Porter visited regularly, bringing updates on his preparations and news from town. Blackwood, true to Porter's prediction, had grown increasingly aggressive in his efforts to undermine Thatcher's position, spreading not only gossip, but also suggestions that the Sullivan Ranch was failing financially, that Thatcher was an incompetent manager who would lose the property regardless of the loan dispute's outcome. These rumors had divided the community, with some believing Blackwood's insinuations, while others, like the Robertsons, remained steadfastly supportive of Thatcher and Alma. The division created an atmosphere of tension in Silver Creek, with sides being chosen and lines drawn in a conflict that had come to represent larger issues of justice, honesty, and the rights of individuals against powerful interests. Through it all, Alma and Thatcher drew closer their shared purpose, creating a bond that neither acknowledged openly, but both felt with increasing intensity. They moved through the days in a kind of harmony, anticipating each other's needs, communicating with glances and gestures as much as with words, finding comfort in one another's presence during times of stress. Hope, meanwhile, continued to thrive, growing stronger and more alert with each passing day. She had begun to smile responsively, her face lighting up when Alma sang to her, or when Thatcher spoke in the gentle tones he reserved for his daughter. These moments of pure joy provided respite from the ongoing concerns about Blackwood and the future of the ranch. One evening, as April's softer weather allowed for sitting on the porch after supper, Thatcher and Alma found themselves side by side in the wooden chairs Clara had positioned to face the sunset. Hope lay contentedly in Alma's arms, her eyes growing heavy as twilight gathered. "She's getting so big," Thatcher observed, his voice warm with paternal pride. "Hard to believe she's the same tiny scrap of humanity you first held in the general store." Alma smiled, remembering that desperate day. "She's strong," she agreed, "like both her parents." Thatcher glanced at her, something unreadable in his expression. "You've become a parent to her too, you know, in all the ways that matter." The simple statement, delivered without fanfare, caught Alma off guard. She looked down at Hope, at the small face that had become so dear to her, and felt a wave of emotion that threatened to overwhelm her, carefully maintained composure. "I care for her," she acknowledged softly. "More than I expected to, more than might be wise." "Why unwise?" Thatcher asked. "Surely love is never that." Alma met his gaze, her own steady despite the tumult within. "Because nothing is permanent, Thatcher. Not in this life. I learned that lesson with cruel clarity when I lost my family. Loving Hope, loving this place." She trailed off, unable to complete the thought. "Loving me," Thatcher suggested, his voice barely above a whisper. The question hung in the air between them, bold in its directness, vulnerable in its honesty. Alma felt her heart rate quicken, a flush rising to her cheeks, despite her attempts to maintain her composure. "I didn't say that," she replied, though without real conviction. "No," Thatcher agreed. "You didn't." He reached out his hand, covering hers where it rested on Hope's blanket. "But I'm saying it, Alma. I love you. Not as a replacement for Clara, not out of gratitude for your help with Hope, but for yourself, for the woman you are, with all your strength and grace and quiet dignity." Alma sat perfectly still, feeling the warmth of his hand on hers, the weight of Hope in her arms, the gravity of the moment pulling at her, in ways she had not allowed herself to feel in years. "You don't know what you're saying," she managed finally. "There are complications, considerations." "I know exactly what I'm saying," Thatcher interrupted gently. "I've had weeks to consider it, to examine my feelings, to be certain they're genuine and not born of convenience or loneliness." His fingers tightened slightly on hers. "I love you, Alma Freeman, and I believe you feel something for me as well, though you're too cautious, too protective of your heart to admit it freely." Alma looked out across the land at the sunset, painting the hills in hues of gold and pink, at the first stars appearing in the deepening blue of the eastern sky. This place had become home to her in ways she had never anticipated when she first agreed to help Thatcher with Hope. And the man beside her had become, what, a friend, certainly. A partner in the shared enterprise of raising Hope and fighting Blackwood. But also something more, something she had been reluctant to name, even in the privacy of her own thoughts. "I do care for you," she admitted finally. "More than I should, perhaps. But there are realities we cannot ignore, Thatcher. The color of my skin, the talk in town, the complications it would create for your case against Blackwood." "I care nothing for any of that," Thatcher said firmly. "The opinions of small-minded people mean less than nothing to me. As for Blackwood, his objections would only confirm that we're on the right path." Hope stirred in Alma's arms, making the small sounds that presaged waking. Alma adjusted the blanket buying time as she sought the right words to express her conflicted emotions. It's not that simple, she said at last. Loving someone, it requires courage. The courage to risk loss again, to open oneself to that possibility, despite knowing how devastating it can be. She looked up, meeting his gaze directly. I'm not sure I have that kind of courage anymore, Thatcher. Not after Isaiah, not after my boys. Thatcher's expression softened with understanding. Fear is natural, Alma. I feel it too. The thought of loving someone, of potentially losing them as I lost Clara, it terrifies me. He squeezed her hand gently. But what terrifies me more is the thought of not loving at all, of closing myself off from the possibility of happiness because I'm afraid of pain. Hope began to cry in earnest now, a hungry sound that demanded immediate attention. The intimate moment fractured as Alma rose, cradling the baby close. I should feed her, she said, grateful for the interruption, for the chance to retreat from a conversation that was venturing into territory too raw, too vulnerable. Thatcher nodded, understanding her need for space. Of course, we can talk more later, when you're ready. Alma disappeared into the house, leaving Thatcher alone on the porch with the fading sunset and his own thoughts. He had spoken his heart, laid bare feelings he had been nurturing for weeks. Now it was up to Alma to decide whether she was willing to risk her heart again, to believe in the possibility of a future together, despite the shadows of their respective pasts. Inside, as she prepared Hope's bottle and settled into the rocking chair, Alma found her thoughts in turmoil. Thatcher's declaration of love had not been entirely unexpected. She had sensed the shift in his feelings, had noticed the way his gaze lingered on her, the increasing tenderness in his voice when he spoke to her. What surprised her was her own reaction, the powerful surge of emotion his words had evoked. What am I to do? She whispered to Hope, who suckled contentedly at her bottle, blissfully unaware of adult complexities. Your father is a good man, a kind man, but loving him, accepting his love, it would change everything. Hope merely blinked up at her with trusting eyes, offering no solutions, but a reminder of the simple, unconditional nature of love in its purest form. The following morning brought an unexpected visitor to Sullivan Ranch: Milo Jenkins, the territorial marshal, a weathered man in his 50s with keen eyes and a reputation for fairness. He arrived as Thatcher was completing his morning chores, his official presence immediately putting Thatcher on alert. Marshal Jenkins. Thatcher greeted him, wiping his hands on a rag as he approached the lawman's horse. This is an unexpected visit. Jenkins dismounted, his expression grave. Sullivan, got some news you need to hear. Might be best if we talk inside. Alma was in the kitchen when the men entered, Hope sleeping peacefully in her cradle nearby. She looked up in surprise at the sight of the marshal, her hands stilling on the dough she was kneading. Mrs. Freeman, Jenkins acknowledged her with a nod. Good to see you looking well. Marshal, Alma returned the greeting cautiously. Can I offer you coffee? Appreciate it, Jenkins said, settling at the table at Thatcher's invitation. He removed his hat, revealing thinning gray hair. Afraid I'm here on official business. There's been a development regarding Harlan Blackwood. Thatcher sat across from him, tension evident in his posture. What kind of development? Jenkins accepted the coffee Alma poured, taking a deliberate sip before responding. Blackwood's been arrested. In Helena yesterday afternoon. Thatcher and Alma exchanged startled glances. Arrested, Thatcher echoed. On what charges? Fraud to start with, Jenkins replied. Banking improprieties, falsified records, misrepresentation of assets. The Territorial Banking Commission's been investigating him for months, apparently. But what pushed it over the edge was evidence of bribery. He tried to pay off a clerk in the land office to falsify records related to the railway project. The railway that's supposed to cross Sullivan Ranch, Alma said, understanding dawning. Exactly, Jenkins confirmed. Seems Blackwood was more desperate than anyone realized. When he couldn't get the land through foreclosure thanks to that injunction your lawyer friend arranged, he tried more direct methods. Thatcher sat back, struggling to absorb the implications. So the case against him, the hearing with Judge Hollister, likely won't be necessary now, Jenkins said. The Banking Commission seized his assets, including the Silver Creek Bank. They'll be reviewing all outstanding loans, including yours. Given the circumstances, I'd expect they will be willing to renegotiate terms that are more reasonable. Relief washed over Thatcher's features, followed quickly by a more complex emotion as the full impact of the news registered. It's over then, he said softly. The threat to the ranch, to Hope's inheritance. It's really over? Looks that way, Jenkins agreed. Though there'll be paperwork formalities to navigate, but the immediate danger has passed. Alma moved to stand beside Thatcher, her hand coming to rest lightly on his shoulder in a gesture of support and shared relief. Thank you for bringing this news personally, Marshal, she said. Jenkins nodded, his observant gaze noting the easy familiarity between them, the unspoken connection evident in their proximity. Seemed the right thing to do considering all you folks have been through. He drained his coffee cup and stood. I should be getting back to town. There's a lot of sorting out to do with Blackwood's affairs. Thatcher rose, extending his hand. I appreciate it, Marshal. More than I can say. Jenkins shook the offered hand firmly. You've built something good here, Sullivan. Something worth fighting for. Glad to see it preserved. His gaze shifted to include Alma in the sleeping hope. For all of you. After the marshal had departed, Thatcher and Alma stood in silence for a long moment, the magnitude of the news settling around them like dust after a storm. I can hardly believe it, Thatcher said finally. After months of worry, of planning, of fighting, it's resolved just like that. Not just like that, Alma corrected gently. Blackwood's actions caught up with him because people like Porter and Judge Hollister were willing to stand against him to investigate, to seek the truth. Thatcher turned to face her, taking both her hands in his. And because you were here, giving me the strength to keep fighting when I might have given up. Alma looked down at their joined hands, his large and work-roughened, hers smaller, and bearing the scars of her own battles. We helped each other, she said softly. That's what people do when they care for one another. Is that what we're doing, Alma, caring for one another? Thatcher's voice was gentle but insistent, returning to the conversation they had begun the previous evening. Because I think it's more than that. I think it's something deeper. Something worth acknowledging openly. Alma raised her eyes to his, seeing in them a warmth and certainty that called to something long dormant within her. I'm afraid, she admitted, the words barely audible. I know, Thatcher said, his thumbs tracing gentle circles on the backs of her hands. So am I, but I'm more afraid of letting fear dictate my life, of missing the chance for happiness, because I'm too cautious to reach for it. Hope chose that moment to wake her cry, drawing Alma's attention. But as she moved to tend to the baby, Thatcher didn't release her hands immediately. Think about it, he said. About us. About what could be. Promise me that much. Alma nodded, her heart racing with emotions too complex to name. I promise. As she lifted Hope from the cradle, soothing her with gentle words and touches, Alma found herself standing at a crossroads. Behind her lay the path of caution, of emotional safety, of carefully maintained independence. Before her stretched a different route, one that offered companionship, shared purpose, the possibility of a new kind of family, but also the risk of devastating loss. The choice was hers to make, and as hope settled against her shoulder, Alma realized that perhaps she had already begun to make it day by day in the small decisions and actions that had led her to this moment. The question now was whether she had the courage to acknowledge it, to step fully into a future she had never imagined for herself, but which now beckoned with unexpected promise. 2 weeks later, as April's showers gave way to the first real warmth of spring, Alma stood in the doorway of the Sullivan home, watching as Thatcher worked with a young colt in the corral. Hope was secured in a sling across Alma's chest, her curious eyes taking in the world with growing awareness. The past fortnight had brought numerous changes to Silver Creek and to Sullivan Ranch. Blackwood's arrest had sent shockwaves through the community, followed by revelations of his years of financial manipulation and questionable dealings. The Territorial Banking Commission had appointed a receiver to manage the bank's affairs, and, as Jenkins had predicted, they had been willing to renegotiate the terms of Thatcher's loan, extending the repayment period and reducing the interest rate to something more reasonable. Porter, whose legal acumen and persistence had played a crucial role in bringing Blackwood's schemes to light, had seen his reputation in the territory enhanced considerably. He had visited the ranch several times, bringing updates on the legal proceedings and increasingly enjoying the simple pleasure of holding Hope and watching her growing responsiveness to the world around her. The news about the railway had been confirmed officially, and preliminary surveys had indeed shown that the most practical route would cross the western section of Sullivan Ranch. Negotiations for right-of-way access had begun, with Porter representing Thatcher's interests and the initial offers suggested a payment substantial enough to secure the ranch's financial future for years to come. But the most significant changes had been less tangible, more personal. The conversation on the porch that evening had opened a door that could not be closed again, had named feelings that could no longer be denied or minimized. Thatcher, true to his word, had given Alma space to consider her feelings, to weigh the risks and possibilities of a deeper relationship. He had not pressed her for an answer, had not attempted to influence her decision through words or actions. But his feelings remained evident in 100 small ways: the warmth of his gaze when it rested on her, the care with which he listened when she spoke, the gentle touches that had become increasingly common between them. And Alma, despite her fears, despite the caution ingrained by loss and hardship, had found herself moving steadily toward a decision she had once thought impossible. Now, watching Thatcher with the colt, his patience, his gentle firmness, the skill with which he built trust between human and animal, Alma felt the last of her resistance giving way. This man, this place, this life they had been building together, it was real, it was valuable. It was worth the risk of heartbreak, worth opening herself to the possibility of love again. As if sensing her thoughts, Thatcher looked up, catching her gaze across the yard. He smiled, that slow, warm smile that had become increasingly familiar, and Alma found herself smiling back without reservation. He secured the colt in its pen and crossed to where she stood, his steps unhurried but purposeful. "You two look beautiful in this light," he said as he reached her, his gaze encompassing both Alma and Hope. "The evening sun is flattering to everyone." Alma replied, though without the deflection such compliments had once evoked in her. "Not just the light," Thatcher said softly. "There's something else, a piece about you that's new." Alma looked down at Hope, then back up at Thatcher. "Not new," she corrected. "Remembered, rediscovered." She took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the moment and the significance of what she was about to say. "I've been thinking, as you asked me to, about us, about what could be." Thatcher's expression grew serious, attentive. And I'm still afraid," Alma admitted. "The thought of loving again, of potentially losing again, it terrifies me." She reached out her scarred hand, finding his weathered one. "But you were right. What terrifies me more is the thought of not loving at all, of denying what I feel because I'm afraid of what might happen." Hope squirmed between them, making small, contented sounds. Thatcher's free hand came up to rest gently on the baby's back, completing a circle of connection between the three of them. "What are you saying, Alma?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "I'm saying yes," she replied simply. "Yes to us. Yes to trying despite the risks. Yes to building something new from the ashes of what we've both lost." The joy that illuminated Thatcher's face was answer enough, but he put it into words nonetheless. "I love you, Alma Freeman. You and Hope are the greatest gifts I could have imagined, the family I thought I'd lost forever when Clara died." "And I love you," Alma said, the words feeling both strange and natural on her tongue. "Not as a replacement for Isaiah, not out of gratitude for giving me purpose again, but for yourself, for the man you are with, all your strength and kindness and determined hope." Thatcher's hand tightened on hers, and for a moment they stood together in the golden evening light, three souls connected by circumstance, choice in the quiet miracle of love, reborn from the ashes of loss. Hope nestled between them, reached up with her tiny hand, grasping at a strand of Alma's hair that had escaped its pins. The gesture, innocent and trusting, seemed to embody the promise of their shared future, uncertain perhaps, but filled with possibility, with the chance for growth and healing. "What happens now?" Alma asked, practical even in this moment of emotional significance. Thatcher smiled, the expression reaching his eyes and warming them to the color of summer sky. "Now we live," he said simply, "day by day, building our life together, making a home for hope, honoring the memories of those we've lost while creating new memories of our own." "That sounds perfect," Alma said, and meant it. As the sun dipped lower, casting long shadows across the land that had become home to them both, Thatcher leaned forward, his lips meeting Alma's in a kiss that was gentle but filled with promise, the promise of a shared future of challenges, faced together, of a love that had emerged from the darkest of winter hours to bloom in the warmth of an unexpected spring. And in that moment, with hope secure between them and the land stretching out around them in all its rugged beauty, both Thatcher and Alma knew that they had found something rare and precious. A second chance at happiness, at family, at the kind of love that transcends loss and transforms lives. A promise after the blizzard fulfilled in ways neither could have imagined when their paths first crossed on that desperate winter day. Epilogue. 20 years later, the small medical clinic in Silver Creek bustled with activity patients coming and going as the morning sun climbed higher in the Montana sky. Behind the desk sat a young woman in her early 20s, her features a striking blend of her parents, Clara's delicate bone structure, and Thatcher's determined chin, with eyes that had indeed matured into her mother's deep blue. Hope Sullivan Freeman, MD, made a final note in her patient records before looking up at the older woman who had just entered the clinic carrying a basket of herbs and tinctures. "Perfect timing, Mama," Hope said with a smile. "Mrs. Thornton's arthritis is flaring again, and your willow bark tincture works better than anything in my medical texts." Alma Sullivan, her hair now streaked with silver, but her posture still straight and dignified, set the basket on the counter. "The old ways have their place alongside the new," she said, a familiar refrain that had guided Hope's unconventional medical education formal training at a women's medical college back east, combined with the traditional healing knowledge Alma had inherited from her grandmother. "How's Papa doing with the new students?" Hope asked, selecting the appropriate bottle from the basket. "Terrorizing them with tales of the old days, most likely," Alma replied, affection evident in her voice. "You know how he loves to tell the story of the blizzard, the desperate ride to town, the beautiful widow who saved his daughter and stole his heart." Hope laughed, the sound reminiscent of Clara's in the photograph that still held a place of honor in the Sullivan home. "He does tend to embellish a bit more each year." "That's storytelling for you," Alma said. "The facts remain the same, but the telling grows richer with time." Outside, the sound of hoofbeats announced a rider approaching at speed. Both women turned as the door burst open, revealing a young man in his late teens flushed with excitement. "Dr. Sullivan Freeman," he exclaimed. "The Robertsons' youngest is having her baby and it's coming fast. Mrs. Robertson sent me to fetch you right away." Hope was already reaching for her medical bag, her movements swift and sure. "Tell them I'm on my way." She turned to Alma. "Mama, go," Alma said, understanding immediately. "I'll handle things here. Take the willow bark for Mrs. Thornton. I'll see she gets it later." Hope paused just long enough to press a quick kiss to Alma's cheek before hurrying out, her purposeful stride reflecting the confidence of a young woman who knew her calling and pursued it without hesitation. Alma watched her go, heart full of the quiet pride that had become a constant companion over the years of raising Hope. The frightened newborn of that desperate winter had grown into a remarkable woman, compassionate, intelligent, determined to use her unique combination of traditional and modern medical knowledge to serve the community that had become home to them all. The Sullivan School, established on the ranch property, as Thatcher and Alma had envisioned, now served children from throughout the territory, regardless of background or heritage. Thatcher still taught writing and natural history, his hair now white, but his eyes as keen as ever, while Alma divided her time between teaching and working alongside Hope at the clinic. Their life together had not been without challenges. Prejudice had not disappeared overnight, and there had been difficult years when some in the community had refused to accept their unconventional family. But they had persevered, supported by friends like the Robertsons and Marcus Porter, now a territorial judge, and gradually the strength of their commitment to each other and to the community had won over all but the most stubborn opponents. As Alma began organizing the clinic for the day's patients, she found herself humming softly the same spiritual "Wade in the Water" that she had once sung to soothe a newborn Hope. The melody carried memories of all that had brought her to this place, this life, the losses that had nearly broken her, the unexpected second chance that had healed her, the love that had transformed them all. Outside, the Montana spring was in full bloom, wildflowers carpeting the hills where once snow had drifted deep against the windows of a lonely ranch house. And in Alma's heart, there bloomed a matching gratitude for the journey that had brought her here, a journey that had begun in grief but had led through courage and choice and love to a life richer and more fulfilling than she could have imagined on that cold winter day when a desperate widower had entered a general store seeking help for his motherless child. A promise made in a blizzard, fulfilled beyond all expectation in the warmth of shared purpose and enduring love.